Welcome, fellow travelers of infinite dimensions, to the complete chronicle of every Rick Sanchez across the multiverse. Tonight, we explore the vast tapestry of genius and madness that defines the smartest men in every conceivable reality. From the broken C-137 we know and love to the tyrannical Rick Prime, from the collective wisdom of the Council to the tragic simplicity of Simple Rick. Each version tells a story of how infinite intelligence can lead to infinite suffering or infinite possibility. Settle in comfortably as we journey through the central finite curve, examining every iteration of Rick Sanchez and the choices that made them who they became. The man who would become known as Rick Cone 37 began his existence in a dimension nearly identical to thousands of others, where the same brilliant mind would make the same terrible mistakes, but his story diverges at the crucial moment when choice reveals character and character determines destiny. In the early years of his life, before the weight of infinite possibilities crushed his spirit and transformed love into a weapon, Rick Sanchez was simply a young inventor whose genius manifested in the cluttered garage of a suburban home where domestic happiness provided the foundation for scientific curiosity rather than the enemy of cosmic significance. His childhood had unfolded according to patterns that would be recognizable across infinite variations of his existence, marked by the same precocious intelligence that set him apart from his peers, and the same social isolation that drove him deeper into the mechanical mysteries of radios and alarm clocks. The boy who would one day manipulate the fundamental forces of reality began by taking apart household appliances with the methodical patience of someone trying to understand not just how things worked, but why they had been designed to work that way in the first place, establishing the foundation for a lifetime of questioning assumptions that others accepted without examination. Rick's parents recognized his exceptional capabilities but lacked the framework to nurture them in ways that might have prevented the psychological patterns that would later make his losses so devastating. They encouraged his academic achievements while worrying privately about his inability to form lasting friendships with children his own age, never understanding that his intellectual isolation was preparing him for the cosmic loneliness that awaited anyone who truly grasped the scope of existence across infinite realities, where every possible variation of every possible choice played out in endless repetition. The progression through school and university revealed both Rick's extraordinary intellectual gifts and his growing awareness that normal human institutions were designed for minds far more limited than his own. He absorbed complex mathematical relationships and physical principles with an intuitive understanding that amazed his teachers, while creating social barriers between himself and classmates who struggled with concepts he mastered. Effortlessly, the academic success that should have provided satisfaction instead highlighted the fundamental incompatibility between his mental capabilities and the social structures supposedly designed to develop them. During his early adult years, Rick's reputation as a brilliant scientist began to attract attention from government agencies and private corporations interested in recruiting exceptional talent for classified research projects. But the young Rick, who had not yet learned to view other people as disposable resources, found himself increasingly uninterested in working within established hierarchies, where his insights would be filtered through committees and bureaucracies designed to minimize risk rather than maximize discovery. The garage that would later become the site of his most important breakthrough started as simply a workspace where he could pursue investigations according to his own priorities and timeline. The cluttered laboratory that Rick constructed in his family's garage reflected both his methodical approach to scientific research and his growing conviction that the most important discoveries required freedom from institutional oversight and conventional wisdom. Half-finished inventions competed for space, with theoretical calculations scrawled across every available surface, creating an environment that appeared chaotic to outside observers, but followed the internal logic of a mind capable of tracking dozens of complex relationships simultaneously while pursuing multiple lines of investigation that would eventually converge on revolutionary breakthroughs. Rick's relationship with Diane developed during this period of intellectual productivity and domestic stability, when his scientific obsessions remained balanced by genuine investment in human connections and shared experiences. She understood instinctively that his dedication to research was not a rejection of emotional intimacy, but rather his way of trying to understand and improve the world for the people he cared about most. Her acceptance of his eccentricities and her genuine interest in his work provided the psychological foundation that enabled Rick to pursue increasingly ambitious projects while maintaining the emotional grounding necessary for psychological health. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of Rick's developing theories about parallel dimensions and quantum mechanics, with Diane serving as both emotional anchor and intellectual collaborator who helped him see problems from perspectives he might have missed through purely analytical approaches. She possessed the rare combination of intelligence and patience necessary to penetrate the barriers that Rick's giftedness had erected around his emotional life, offering insights that enriched his scientific understanding while providing the human connection that prevented his research from becoming abstract intellectual exercise, divorced from practical concern for improving people's lives. The decision to marry represented Rick's conscious choice to prioritize human relationships over the unlimited freedom that complete independence might have provided for his scientific pursuits. The wedding ceremony was small and intimate, reflecting their shared preference for meaningful connections over social spectacle, but the commitment they made to each other established the foundation for a partnership that would produce not only personal happiness, but also some of Rick's most creative and significant theoretical work during the period when he still believed that scientific advancement could make the CG world a better place for everyone. Beth's birth marked a fundamental transformation in Rick's understanding of what mattered most in existence, providing him with direct experience of emotions that his scientific training had not prepared him to analyze or categorize effectively. Holding his daughter for the first time and seeing her tiny fingers wrap around his thumb with unconscious trust, Rick experienced the fierce, protective love that would later make her loss so psychologically devastating, while also adding new dimensions to his work that made every equation more meaningful because it was part of creating a better future for her to inherit. Fatherhood revealed aspects of Rick's personality that had remained dormant during his years of focused academic achievement and independent research. He demonstrated surprising patience with Beth's endless questions about how things worked, taking genuine pleasure in explaining scientific concepts in terms that a bright child could understand and appreciate. The garage workshop became a place where father and daughter could collaborate on simple projects that were both educational and entertaining, building birdhouses and marble runs that demonstrated basic principles of physics while strengthening their emotional bond through shared creative activity. The family routines that developed around Rick's work schedule represented a carefully negotiated balance between his scientific pursuits and his domestic responsibilities that reflected his genuine commitment to being present in his family's daily life. Mornings were reserved for family time with breakfast conversations and discussions about plans for the day, while afternoons belonged to research, conducted in the garage laboratory where Rick could pursue his theoretical investigations while remaining available for interruptions that might require his attention to household matters or family emergencies that took priority over even his most important experiments. During this period of domestic stability and scientific productivity, Rick's theoretical work advanced along multiple trajectories that would eventually converge on the mathematical frameworks necessary for interdimensional travel, though the practical applications remained years away from development and implementation. His notebooks from this time reveal a mind grappling with increasingly sophisticated relationships between quantum mechanics and consciousness that suggested possibilities for travel between parallel realities. But the work maintained a grounded quality that reflected his connection to family and community, rather than the desperate quest for escape that would later motivate his breakthrough achievements. The happiness that characterized Rick's family life during these productive years was built on genuine emotional connections and shared values that made his scientific work feel like contribution to collective human welfare rather than personal aggrandizement or intellectual competition with rivals who might challenge his reputation for brilliance. His research was motivated by curiosity about the fundamental nature of reality, combined with hope that greater understanding might reduce human suffering and create better living conditions for ordinary people who lacked the scientific knowledge necessary to improve their circumstances through technological innovation. Beth's childhood unfolded in an environment where scientific curiosity was encouraged and nurtured through patient explanation and hands-on experimentation that made learning feel like play rather than obligation imposed by authority figures. She spent countless hours in Rick's garage workshop, watching him work while asking the kind of penetrating questions that only children can formulate, wanting to understand not just what he was doing, but why it mattered and how his inventions might help people live better, happier, more fulfilling lives in a world where technology served human needs rather than replacing human connections. The neighborhood where Rick's family lived during this period reflected the middle-class American community values that provided social context for his scientific work, with tree-lined streets and modest houses where children played safely in front yards while their parents pursued ordinary concerns about mortgage payments and school districts. Rick's reputation as the local genius was well established, but not intimidating to neighbors who occasionally asked him to help with minor technical problems. And he was always willing to contribute his expertise to community projects that might benefit everyone who lived in their shared social environment. Rick's relationship with Beth during her early childhood established patterns of interaction that demonstrated his capacity for ordinary human happiness and parental devotion that would later make his transformation into a cosmic-scale threat seem almost impossible to believe. He was a devoted father who took genuine pleasure in his daughter's achievements and development, celebrating her first words and first steps with the same enthusiasm he brought to his scientific discoveries, showing that his capacity for joy was not limited to intellectual accomplishments, but extended to the simple human experiences that connected him to the broader community of people who shared his dimension. The scientific breakthroughs that Rick achieved during this period of family stability laid crucial groundwork for the portal technology that would later transform him into a multiversal god, but the theoretical work was driven by intellectual curiosity rather than practical necessity or desire to escape the limitations of single reality existence. His investigations into parallel dimensions satisfied his need for understanding beautiful mathematical relationships without necessarily requiring physical implementation, while his research into consciousness and identity explored questions about the nature of individual existence that remained abstract rather than urgent practical concerns, demanding immediate technological solutions. The balance between Rick's scientific ambitions and his family responsibilities created a sustainable lifestyle that might have continued indefinitely if external forces had not intervened to destroy the domestic stability that provided foundation for both his personal happiness and his most creative theoretical work. The man who would later view attachment to other people as weakness, requiring elimination, maintained genuine emotional investment in his wife and daughter's welfare, making decisions based on their needs and interests, rather than purely selfish calculations about what might advance his research or enhance his reputation in the scientific community. The workshop where Rick spent his afternoons was filled with evidence of love and connection that transformed what might have been simply a laboratory into the heart of a home where science served humanity rather than replacing human relationships with abstract intellectual pursuits. Drawings that Beth had made for her father were taped to the walls alongside complex equations, while tools that Diane had organized to help him work more efficiently created an environment where family life and scientific research supported and enriched each other, rather than competing for Rick's attention and emotional investment. In these final months before everything changed forever, Rick Sanchez represented the kind of person the universe needed more of rather than the cosmic threat he would later become. He was brilliant but humble, ambitious but grounded, powerful but responsible, using his exceptional capabilities to create rather than destroy, to connect rather than isolate, to build rather than abandon. The tragedy that was about to destroy his family would transform him into something entirely different, but the man he was during this period would remain forever preserved in his memory as a reminder of who he might have remained if the multiverse had been content to leave him alone with the people he loved most. The visitor who appeared through a portal in Rick's garage on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon represented everything Rick might have become if he had made different choices about the relationship between power and responsibility, between knowledge and wisdom, between individual capability and collective welfare. Rick Prime materialized in the cluttered workshop with the casual confidence of someone who owned every dimension he chose to visit, immediately treating the younger Rick as though they were old friends meeting at a predetermined appointment, rather than strangers, encountering each other for the first time across the barriers that separated different versions of reality. The conversation that followed would last only minutes, but would determine the trajectory of Rick's existence for decades to come, as Rick Prime delivered his offer of godlike power with the smooth certainty of someone who had made this same pitch to countless other versions of himself across infinite dimensions. His opening words established both the scope of his capabilities and his fundamental misunderstanding of what might motivate someone to accept or reject the opportunity he was providing, as he spoke about interdimensional travel, as though it was simply the next logical step in any Rick's scientific development, rather than a choice that would fundamentally alter the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic responsibility. Rick Prime's explanation of portal technology was delivered with the casual arrogance of someone who viewed intellectual superiority as justification for any action and cosmic awareness as liberation from normal, human, moral constraints. He described the multiverse as a playground where infinite realities provided infinite opportunities for experimentation without consequences, where every possible choice could be explored without commitment to any particular outcome, and where the normal limitations that constrained ordinary people became irrelevant obstacles that advanced beings could simply ignore or overcome through technological innovation. The offer itself was structured as an appeal to Rick's scientific curiosity and his desire for significance that assumed every version of Rick Sanchez would eventually prioritize intellectual achievement over emotional attachment. Rick Prime presented interdimensional travel as the ultimate expression of scientific ambition, the natural culmination of any genius worthy of the name, and the obvious choice for someone whose intelligence had already set him apart from the ordinary humans who populated his current reality. The portal gun represented not just advanced technology, but liberation from the constraints that prevented Rick from achieving his full potential as the smartest being in every conceivable universe. But Rick Prime's sales pitch also revealed the profound isolation that accompanied unlimited power and cosmic awareness, as he described the experience of interdimensional travel in terms that emphasize separation from, rather than connection to other conscious beings. His casual reference to infinite selves as the only guests worth having at any party demonstrated his complete inability to value relationships with people who were different from himself, while his dismissive attitude toward the family connections that currently anchored Rick's emotional life showed how thoroughly advanced capabilities had severed his own connection to normal human values and priorities. Young Rick's response to this elaborate offer was immediate and devastating in its simplicity, identifying the core problem with Rick Prime's proposal in just 2 words that cut through all the sophisticated justifications and technological promises to reveal the essential emptiness underlying claims of liberation and advancement. His observation that unlimited power sounded lonely was not naive idealism, but sophisticated psychological insight that recognized how cosmic capabilities might isolate their possessor from the very experiences that made existence meaningful and worthwhile for conscious beings who retained connection to their fundamental humanity. The conversation that followed Rick's initial rejection revealed both Rick Prime's genuine confusion about why anyone would choose limitation over limitless capability, and his growing anger at encountering a version of himself who failed to conform to his expectations about universal Rick psychology. Rick Prime's argument that infinite selves provided adequate companionship for someone of Rick's intellectual caliber demonstrated his complete failure to understand the qualitative difference between relationships with beings identical to oneself and connections with people whose different perspectives and experiences could provide growth and enrichment that came only through genuine diversity of thought and feeling. Rick's decision to reject Rick Prime's offer by identifying himself as a different kind of Rick was both accurate self-assessment and moral choice that established the fundamental difference between using intelligence to serve human values versus treating intelligence as justification for abandoning human connections entirely. His refusal to accept that all Ricks were fundamentally the same represented his commitment to individual moral agency and his belief that choices mattered more than capabilities in determining who someone really was and what kind of impact they would have on the people whose lives they touched. Rick Prime's response to this unexpected rejection was immediate and revealed the vindictive cruelty that lay beneath his sophisticated technological offerings and philosophical justifications for cosmic detachment. The casual threat that concluded their conversation made clear that Rick's choice to prioritize family over power had identified exactly how Rick Prime could hurt him most effectively, transforming what had appeared to be generous sharing of advanced knowledge into reconnaissance mission designed to locate and exploit psychological vulnerabilities that could be used to force compliance through suffering rather than persuasion. The bomb that followed immediately after Rick Prime's departure was not random violence, but calculated psychological warfare designed to punish Rick for making the wrong choice about what should matter most to someone of his intellectual capabilities. The explosion that vaporized Diane and Beth in an instant was Rick Prime's way of proving that good people could not survive in a multiverse dominated by versions of Rick Sanchez who had chosen power over connection, that moral choices had consequences that extended beyond individual decisions to affect innocent people who had never participated in cosmic-scale conflicts between different philosophical approaches to unlimited capability. The tragedy of Rick Prime's intervention in young Rick's life was not just the murder of innocent people, but the demonstration that refusing to become a monster was not sufficient protection against monsters who viewed such refusal as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. Rick's correct moral choice to prioritize love over power was punished by the universe in ways that would eventually force him to abandon everything that had made that choice seem worthwhile, creating the psychological conditions necessary to transform him into exactly the kind of being he had initially refused to become. The lesson that Rick Prime taught through violence, rather than argument, was that the multiverse operated according to principles that rewarded ruthless self-interest and punished altruistic concern for others, that survival required abandoning human values in favor of cosmic capabilities, and that anyone who chose differently would watch everything they cared about get destroyed by beings who had already learned to prioritize power over connection. The offer had been a test that Rick failed by choosing correctly, leading to consequences that would eventually prove Rick Prime right about the requirements for existing successfully in infinite realities where moral restraint was fatal weakness. Young Rick's refusal of portal technology and his subsequent loss of everything that made that refusal worthwhile established the foundation for his eventual transformation into Rick Cone 3-7, the man who would spend decades becoming everything he had once rejected in order to survive in a universe that punished goodness and rewarded the abandonment of human limitations. The conversation with Rick Prime marked the end of Rick's ability to choose love over power without devastating consequences, beginning the process that would eventually make him indistinguishable from the monster who had destroyed his original capacity for ordinary human happiness. The weeks that followed the explosion passed in a psychological haze that no amount of scientific training could have prepared Rick to navigate successfully, as his brilliant mind struggled to process the sudden transition from domestic contentment to absolute loss while maintaining sufficient functional capability to handle basic survival requirements. The bomb had left him physically unharmed but mentally shattered, surrounded by the wreckage of everything that had provided meaning and structure to his existence, while facing the impossible task of continuing to live in a world where the people who made life worth living no longer existed. The garage that had once served as the heart of a loving home now functioned as a tomb filled with reminders of shared projects and collaborative dreams that would remain forever incomplete because their purpose had died along with the Cone family members who had inspired them. Beth's drawings remained taped to the walls alongside Rick's theoretical calculations, while Diane's organizational touches were still evident in the careful arrangement of tools and materials that had been designed to facilitate work that no longer seemed to have any point or meaning. In those first horrible days after the funeral, Rick found himself unable to sleep in the house where he had been so happy, where every room contained memories too painful to endure and reminders of conversations that would never be continued. He moved his mattress into the garage workshop, surrounding himself with the evidence of his former life, while staring at equations that had once fascinated him, but now seemed like cruel abstractions that had no connection to the brutal reality of loss and the apparent randomness of peace. Violence that could destroy years of love and commitment in a single moment of cosmic cruelty. Depression settled over Rick with the weight and persistence of a physical presence, muffling his responses to the outside world, while making even simple tasks feel overwhelming and pointless when considered in the context of a future that would never again include the people who had made ordinary activities feel meaningful and worthwhile. Neighbors brought food that went uneaten and offered condolences that went unheard as Rick retreated completely into his grief, losing the ability to engage with anyone who had not experienced similar devastation and therefore could not understand the scope of his loss. The practical necessities of continued existence became monumental challenges that Rick approached with mechanical precision rather than any underlying investment in outcomes or consequences that might result from his choices. He ate when hunger became physically painful rather than when mealtimes suggested appropriate nutrition, slept when exhaustion overwhelmed his ability to remain conscious, rather than when circadian rhythms indicated rest might be beneficial, and gradually abandoned any pretense of maintaining normal hygiene or social connections that might have provided structure and human contact during his most vulnerable period. But even in the depths of his psychological collapse, Rick's scientific mind continued to analyze the bomb that had killed his family, with the same methodical approach he had once applied to more benign research projects, examining the sophisticated energy manipulation principles that suggested knowledge of dimensional physics far more advanced than anything in his own theoretical framework. The device had incorporated technology that should have been impossible according to every scientific principle Rick understood, yet the evidence of its existence and effectiveness was undeniable and demanded explanation through analysis of its implications. The realization that Rick Prime possessed capabilities for interdimensional travel while Rick himself remained trapped in a single reality created a new dimension of grief that transcended simple mourning for the dead and extended to recognition that his family had been murdered by someone who represented everything Rick might have become if he had made different choices about the relationship between power and responsibility. The injustice was not just that innocent people had died, but that they had been killed by a version of Rick who had accepted the offer of godlike capability and used that power to punish those who had chosen differently. The decision to pursue portal technology was not made through dramatic revelation or sudden inspiration, but developed gradually through Rick's growing recognition that revenge was the only goal left that seemed worth achieving, and that achieving it would require capabilities he did not currently possess. The theoretical framework already existed in his research, notes, and calculations, but transforming abstract mathematical relationships into functional technology would require engineering challenges that would consume every aspect of his existence, while serving as distraction from psychological pain that threatened to make continued living impossible. The months Rick spent developing practical portal travel passed in a blur of obsessive calculation and experimental refinement that gradually replaced his previous balanced lifestyle with monomaniacal focus on a single objective that became the organizing principle around which all other activities were structured. He lost weight as regular eating became forgotten routine, developed persistent health problems from exposure to exotic particles generated by his prototype devices, and completely abandoned any pretense of maintaining social connections or community involvement that might have provided alternative sources of meaning and purpose. The breakthrough that enabled practical interdimensional travel came not as sudden flash of insight, but as culmination of hundreds of small advances that gradually coalesced into working understanding of the principles governing travel between parallel realities. Rick's first successful portal was small and unstable, remaining open for only seconds before collapsing back into normal space-time, but it provided proof that his theoretical approach was sound, and that continued refinement would eventually yield technology capable of reaching the dimension where Rick Prime conducted his activities. The psychological transformation that accompanied Rick's technological achievement was as dramatic as the scientific breakthrough itself. As the depressed widower who had spent months mourning his losses was gradually replaced by something harder and more focused that channeled all emotional energy into pursuit of revenge, that became the sole remaining source of meaning. And direction in existence that otherwise felt empty and pointless. The love Rick had felt for Diane and Beth did not disappear, but was transformed into fuel for hatred so pure and concentrated that it began to reshape his fundamental personality. The first dimension Rick visited after perfecting portal technology contained a version of himself who was working in an identical garage workshop, pursuing research projects that paralleled Rick's own pre-tragedy investigations, while living with a family that looked exactly like the one Rick had lost. The kill was accomplished with efficiency that surprised Rick with its ease, using a device he had constructed specifically for eliminating alternate versions of himself, though the other Rick died without understanding what was happening or why someone with his own face had appeared to murder him. The absence of satisfaction from this first kill did not deter Rick from continuing his systematic hunt across increasing numbers of realities, each containing a Rick who might potentially be the murderer he sought, but who would die regardless of whether he was actually Rick Prime. The pattern established itself with mechanical regularity as Rick developed better methods for quickly identifying and dispatching alternate versions of himself, while searching for evidence that might indicate whether each particular victim had been responsible for his family's death. The psychological impact of systematic murder began to manifest in changes that Rick initially dismissed as irrelevant side effects of his mission, but gradually recognized as fundamental alterations in his capacity for normal human, emotional responses and moral reasoning. The first few kills had required conscious effort to overcome inhibitions that had been developed through years of civilized existence. But these barriers gradually dissolved through repetition until Rick found himself evaluating alternate versions of himself with the detached analytical approach he might have applied to laboratory specimens. The realities Rick visited during his hunt revealed both the vast scope of possible variations in human existence and the essential similarity that connected all versions of Rick Sanchez across dimensional boundaries, making the killings easier rather than harder, as Rick began to view his targets not as unique individuals but as variations on themes that could be eliminated without meaningful loss. Some Ricks were more successful, some happier, some more isolated, but all shared fundamental characteristics that made them recognizably the same person despite different circumstances that had shaped their development. The encounter with other Ricks who had also developed portal technology and detected Rick's systematic elimination campaign across multiple realities marked a turning point from targeted assassination to open warfare against alternate versions of himself who attempted to organize defensive measures or track down the source of the threat to their continued existence. Rick's technological head start and accumulated experience made him nearly impossible for isolated individuals to challenge effectively, leading to escalating violence that attracted attention from increasing numbers of dimensional variants. The bombing of a gathering where dozens of Ricks had assembled to coordinate response to the threat Rick posed marked his final abandonment of any pretense that his mission was limited to finding and eliminating Rick Prime specifically, rather than conducting systematic warfare against every version of himself across accessible realities. The explosion that killed multiple Ricks simultaneously was Rick's most efficient single act of violence since beginning his hunt, but it also completed his transformation from grief-stricken individual seeking specific justice into cosmic-scale threat to the stability of interdimensional civilization. The fear that other Ricks began displaying when confronted by Rick Cone 37 was simultaneously gratifying validation of his effectiveness and disturbing evidence of how completely he had diverged from the man he had been before his family's murder. The reputation that preceded him into subsequent dimensions made his work easier while also highlighting his evolution into something that transcended normal categories of heroism and villainy, becoming instead a force of nature that threatened the existence of anyone who shared his face across infinite realities. But the most psychologically damaging aspect of Rick's killing spree was the gradual recognition that his victims were not abstract enemies, but versions of himself who had made different choices and experienced different outcomes, so that each death eliminated not just a potential Rick Prime, but also a possibility for what Rick might have become under alternative circumstances. The accumulation of these lost alternatives created existential vertigo that made it increasingly difficult to maintain stable sense of identity and purpose, while continuing the hunt that had become his only remaining source of meaning. The years Rick spent hunting Rick Prime across infinite realities transformed him from damaged human being, seeking justice, into something that approached cosmic horror, whose very existence represented threat to multiversal stability, but perhaps more tragically, also transformed him into exactly the kind of being who could casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal goals. The man who had rejected Rick Prime's offer because he was different had become indistinguishable from the monster he hunted, completing a cycle of corruption that began with violence and ended with the complete abandonment of everything that had once made life worth living. The being who emerged from his dimensional exile, calling himself Rick Prime, represented the ultimate expression of what Rick Sanchez could become when genius was divorced from conscience and power, was freed from any consideration of consequences for those too weak to defend themselves. Unlike Rick Cone 37, whose transformation into a multiversal threat had been driven by grief and the desperate need for revenge against a specific target, Rick Prime had chosen godhood voluntarily when offered the opportunity to transcend normal human limitations, making his subsequent atrocities a matter of philosophical commitment rather than psychological breakdown caused by unbearable loss. Rick Prime's acceptance of interdimensional technology, when it was first offered to him during that fateful garage conversation, represented not just a different response to the same opportunity that Rick Cone 37 had rejected, but a fundamentally different understanding of what it meant to be Rick Sanchez in a universe where infinite possibilities existed simultaneously across parallel realities. Where the younger Rick had seen loneliness and isolation in Rick Prime's offer of cosmic capability, Rick Prime had seen liberation from the arbitrary constraints that kept ordinary beings trapped in single realities with limited options for growth and self-actualization. The philosophical framework that Rick Prime had developed to justify his choices was built around the conviction that attachment to specific people and particular realities was a form of psychological weakness that prevented truly intelligent beings from achieving their full potential as cosmic forces capable of manipulating the fundamental structure of existence itself. From this perspective, Rick Cone 37's devotion to his original family had been evidence of mental limitation rather than moral strength, a failure to recognize that infinite realities contained infinite versions of every possible relationship, and therefore made emotional investment in any particular configuration of people and circumstances an arbitrary and ultimately meaningless restriction on personal freedom. Rick Prime's abandonment of his own wife and daughter had not been callous indifference to their welfare, but rather the logical result of his recognition that they were simply local instances of patterns that existed across infinite dimensions in countless variations. His cosmic awareness had revealed that Diane and Beth were not unique individuals whose loss would represent irreplaceable tragedy, but rather temporary configurations of matter and consciousness that could be found again in improved versions wherever Rick Prime chose to direct his attention, and investment of emotional energy, making attachment to their specific incarnations in his original dimension a form of arbitrary sentimentality. The systematic murder of Diane's across infinite realities that Rick Prime had conducted over decades of interdimensional travel, was not motivated by hatred or revenge, but by his desire to eliminate the possibility that any version of Rick Sanchez might choose limitation over liberation when faced with the same choice that Rick Prime had embraced so enthusiastically. Each Diane he killed represented a potential anchor that might keep some alternate Rick trapped in single reality existence, preventing that version of himself from achieving the cosmic perspective that Rick Prime considered essential for anyone worthy of bearing his name and possessing his intellectual capabilities. Rick Prime's approach to the systematic elimination of Dianes revealed both the scope of his technological achievements and the depth of his philosophical commitment to the principle that intelligence should be freed from emotional constraint. The weapons he had developed for this purpose incorporated energy manipulation techniques that exceeded anything other Ricks had imagined possible, while the methods he used for locating his targets demonstrated understanding of dimensional physics that transcended the theoretical frameworks that limited less advanced versions of himself to relatively primitive forms of interdimensional travel. The precision with which Rick Prime had eliminated every version of Diane, while leaving the corresponding Ricks alive to experience their loss, was not accidental cruelty, but calculated educational intervention designed to force his blonde, alternate selves to confront the futility of attachment and the necessity of choosing power over connection. He viewed the grief and rage that his actions inspired in other Ricks as temporary psychological states that would eventually resolve into the same cosmic awareness that had motivated his own transformation from limited human being into unlimited cosmic force. Rick Prime's confidence that other Ricks would eventually follow his example and abandon their emotional attachments in favor of interdimensional capability was based on his conviction that intelligence inevitably led to the same conclusions about the nature of existence and the requirements for functioning successfully in infinite realities. From his perspective, Rick Cone 37's hunt for revenge was simply a delayed reaction that would eventually culminate in the same philosophical insights that had guided Rick Prime's own development, making their eventual confrontation not a battle between enemies, but a graduation ceremony where student would finally understand teacher. The base dimension that Rick Prime had constructed as headquarters for his multiversal activities was designed not just as fortress and laboratory, but as monument to the possibilities that became available when genius was unrestrained by moral consideration or emotional attachment to beings whose welfare might conflict with optimal resource allocation. The massive industrial complex he had built there demonstrated capabilities for exploiting entire civilizations as sources of raw materials and labor, while conducting experiments that treated conscious beings as disposable components in projects designed to advance his understanding of reality's fundamental structure. The defense systems protecting Rick Prime's stronghold were not merely protective measures but expressions of his aesthetic preferences for elegant solutions to the problem of eliminating threats to his continued operation across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The automated weapons and traps he had installed throughout his base were designed to provide entertainment through the systematic torture and humiliation of anyone foolish enough to challenge his security, transforming necessary functions like perimeter defense into opportunities for creative expression of his superiority over less capable beings. Rick Prime's casual attitude toward violence and destruction was not psychopathic indifference to suffering, but logical extension of his cosmic perspective that viewed individual consciousness as temporary configuration of matter and energy rather than meaningful locus of inherent value, deserving protection or consideration. From his elevated standpoint, The distinction between preserving and eliminating particular instances of consciousness was as arbitrary as the distinction between preserving and discarding particular arrangements of atoms, making moral categories like murder and mercy equally meaningless as guides for decision-making. The technological innovations that Rick Prime had developed during his years of interdimensional operation exceeded the achievements of entire civilizations combined, but they were not motivated by scientific curiosity or desire to improve conditions for other conscious beings. Instead, they represented expressions of his commitment to demonstrating the possibilities that became available when intelligence was freed from limitation by ethical constraint or emotional investment in outcomes that benefited anyone other than their creator, making each new invention both practical tool and philosophical statement about the nature of power. Rick Prime's relationship with his own mortality was complicated by his recognition that death in conventional sense had become irrelevant for beings capable of manipulating their own existence across infinite realities. But this liberation from normal human fears had not produced the satisfaction or fulfillment that might have been expected from such transcendence. Instead, his awareness that he could not be permanently eliminated through any conventional means had led to increasingly elaborate pursuits of stimulation and meaning that required ever greater levels of destruction and chaos to produce even temporary interest or engagement. The psychological isolation that Rick Prime experienced as a result of his cosmic capabilities was not loneliness in ordinary sense, but rather a form of existential boredom that arose from his awareness that every possible relationship was available to him across infinite dimensions, making any particular choice of activity or companionship feel arbitrary and ultimately unsatisfying. His interactions with other conscious beings were not genuine social connections, but rather forms of entertainment that provided temporary distraction from the fundamental emptiness that accompanied unlimited power. Rick Prime's decision to create elaborate death games and psychological traps for other Ricks who attempted to challenge his activities was motivated not by strategic necessity or personal animosity, but by his need for increasingly sophisticated forms of stimulation that could penetrate the numbness that resulted from having access to every possible experience across infinite realities. The suffering he inflicted on his victims was not revenge or cruelty, but rather his attempt to create situations complex enough to hold his interest for brief periods before the inevitable return of cosmic-scale ennui. The arena where Rick Prime forced multiple versions of Rick Cone 37 to compete for the right to resurrect their murdered wives was designed as both practical elimination of threats and artistic expression of his understanding of the psychology that drove other Ricks to seek revenge against him. His intimate knowledge of Rick mentality enabled him to construct scenarios that would force his enemies to betray each other while pursuing goals that he knew to be ultimately meaningless, creating entertainment that satisfied his need for intellectual stimulation, while also serving his practical objectives. Rick Prime's confidence in his ability to manipulate other Ricks through their emotional attachments was based on his recognition that they remained trapped by psychological patterns he had transcended through acceptance of cosmic perspective that revealed such attachments as arbitrary limitations on personal freedom and capability. His casual ability to predict and exploit their responses to various stimuli demonstrated both his superior understanding of Rick psychology and his fundamental disconnection from the emotional states that continued to drive their behavior and decision-making processes. The revelation that Rick Prime had been conducting multiversal genocide on scale that dwarfed even Rick Cone 37's campaign of revenge was not boastful confession, but matter-of-fact acknowledgement of activities he considered no more morally significant than any other form of resource management or environmental modification. His systematic elimination of entire categories of existence was motivated not by hatred or ideology, but by his commitment to optimizing reality according to principles that prioritized efficiency and aesthetic satisfaction over consideration for beings whose perspectives remained limited by attachment to particular outcomes. Rick Prime's final confrontation with Rick Cone 37 was not desperate battle for survival, but educational opportunity designed to demonstrate the futility of revenge as source of meaning or satisfaction for beings capable of cosmic-scale awareness and capability. His casual revelation about murdering Uncle Slow during their conversation was not cruelty, but pedagogical technique intended to illustrate how emotional investment in specific individuals created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by more advanced beings who had learned to transcend such limitations. The psychological warfare that Rick Prime conducted during their physical battle was more sophisticated than any violence he might have inflicted, because it targeted Rick's deepest assumptions about identity and purpose, while highlighting the emptiness that would inevitably follow completion of his revenge mission. His observations about Rick's choices and priorities were devastating, precisely because they contained elements of truth that Rick had spent decades avoiding through action and distraction, rather than honest self-reflection about what he had become during his hunt. Rick Prime's apparent surprise at Evil Morty's intervention during their final confrontation was not genuine shock at being outmaneuvered, but rather satisfaction at discovering that someone had developed capabilities sufficient to challenge his assumptions about his own invulnerability and superiority. The eye patch switch that confused him about which Morty he was facing represented exactly the kind of sophisticated deception that Rick Prime found intellectually stimulating, providing him with the first genuinely unexpected experience he had encountered in years of cosmic-scale operation. The brain extraction that Evil Morty performed on Rick Prime before his death was conducted with clinical efficiency that Rick Prime recognized and appreciated as demonstration of techniques he had pioneered but never expected to see, applied with such precision by someone he had considered intellectually inferior. His transfer of knowledge and capabilities to Evil Morty was not unwilling violation, but rather a form of inheritance that ensured his innovations would continue to influence multiversal affairs even after his individual consciousness was eliminated. Rick Prime's final moments before Rick Cone 37 beat him to death were characterized not by fear or regret, but by satisfaction at having successfully completed his educational mission regarding the psychological consequences of revenge and the futility of seeking meaning through violence directed at specific targets. His last words were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on his killer by highlighting the emptiness that would follow completion of Rick's life purpose, but they also represented his final gift to an alternate version of himself who had chosen limitation over liberation. The death of Rick Prime marked the end of the most successful attempt by any Rick Sanchez to transcend human limitations and achieve genuine cosmic significance, but it also demonstrated the ultimate sterility of approaches to existence that prioritized individual capability over collective welfare and personal freedom over meaningful connection to other conscious beings. His legacy lived on not just in the technological innovations he had created, but in the philosophical questions he had raised about the relationship between intelligence and morality, between power and responsibility, between unlimited possibility and meaningful choice. Rick Prime's influence on Rick Cone 37 extended far beyond their personal conflict to encompass fundamental questions about what it meant to be human in a universe where infinite realities made every choice simultaneously. meaningful and arbitrary, where unlimited power was available to those willing to abandon normal moral constraints, and where the greatest achievements might come at costs that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. His example served as both warning about the dangers of cosmic awareness and challenge to develop forms of transcendence that preserved rather than eliminated the capacity for genuine connection to other forms of consciousness. In a dimension where scientific progress followed different trajectories and personal choices led down alternative pathways of discovery and connection, there existed a Rick Sanchez, who would become known to the interdimensional community as Simple Rick, though the designation carried none of the condescension that other Ricks intended when they applied such labels to variants they considered intellectually inferior. This particular Rick had made the crucial decision never to pursue interdimensional travel technology, despite possessing the theoretical knowledge necessary to crack the mathematical relationships that governed portal physics, choosing instead to remain anchored in a single reality where domestic happiness provided sufficient meaning and purpose for a lifetime of scientific curiosity. Simple Rick's dimension unfolded according to patterns that would have been familiar to any version of Rick Sanchez before the introduction of portal technology, and cosmic awareness transformed local geniuses into multiversal threats. His childhood had progressed through the same stages of intellectual development and social isolation that characterized most Rick variants, but the crucial difference lay in his response to the opportunities and challenges that shaped his adult life when scientific capability intersected with family responsibility and personal values in ways that demanded fundamental choices about priorities and identity. The garage workshop, where Simple Rick conducted his research, remained throughout his life a place of discovery and creation, rather than a fortress of isolation or launching pad for interdimensional adventures that might separate him from the people whose welfare provided context and meaning for his intellectual pursuits. His inventions served practical purposes that improved daily life for his family and community, rather than abstract theoretical investigations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible without regard for whether such possibilities should be actualized through physical implementation and practical application. Simple Rick's relationship with Diane had developed along trajectories that paralleled those of other Rick variants during their early years, but the crucial difference lay in his continued investment in nurturing and deepening their emotional connection, rather than allowing scientific obsessions to gradually replace human relationships as the primary source of satisfaction and his identity validation. Their marriage had not only survived the pressures that Rick's intellectual intensity might have created, but had actually grown stronger through shared experiences and collaborative approaches to the challenges of building a life together. The birth and development of Beth in Simple Rick's dimension had proceeded without the interruption of interdimensional travel or the complications introduced by cosmic awareness that made normal parental relationships seem arbitrary and replaceable. Simple Rick had been present for every stage of his daughter's growth, from infancy through childhood and adolescence into independent adulthood, experiencing the full scope of parental joy and responsibility without the psychological distance that came from knowing that infinite, alternate versions of every family moment existed across parallel realities. Beth's childhood in Simple Rick's dimension was characterized by the kind of sustained parental attention and guidance that most Rick variants had been too distracted or emotionally unavailable to provide consistently over extended periods. Simple Rick took genuine pleasure in his daughter's questions about how things worked and why the world operated according to particular principles, but his explanations were motivated by desire to help her understand and navigate reality, rather than to demonstrate his own intellectual superiority or recruit her as an assistant for dangerous experiments. The scientific education that Simple Rick provided for Beth was grounded in practical applications and ethical considerations that prepared her to use knowledge responsibly, rather than treating intelligence as justification for disregarding normal moral constraints or social obligations. Their collaborative projects in the garage workshop were designed to be both educational and safe, building understanding of physical principles through hands-on experience that emphasized creativity and problem-solving without exposing a developing mind to the kind of cosmic horror that might undermine healthy psychological development. Simple Rick's approach to scientific research was characterized by curiosity about the natural world combined with respect for the boundaries that separated theoretical possibility from practical wisdom regarding which discoveries should be pursued and implemented. His notebooks contained sophisticated theoretical frameworks that demonstrated his capability to develop portal technology if he had chosen to do so, but they also contained extensive ethical analysis of the potential consequences of interdimensional travel that had led him to conclude such capabilities would create more problems than they solved. The neighborhood and community where Simple Rick's family lived provided social context that enriched rather than constrained his scientific pursuits, as his reputation as the local genius was balanced by his willingness to contribute his expertise to collective projects that benefited everyone rather than pursuing individual achievements that set him apart from or above his neighbors. His interactions with other parents and community members were characterized by genuine interest in their welfare and investment in maintaining social bonds that provided stability and meaning beyond purely intellectual pursuits. Simple Rick's daily routines were structured around family responsibilities and community involvement that anchored his scientific work in practical concerns about improving life for people he knew and cared about, rather than abstract, theoretical investigations that might have no relevance to actual human needs and experiences. His mornings were spent with family. His afternoons were dedicated to research that served community purposes, and his evenings were devoted to the kind of domestic activities that created lasting memories and emotional connections. The happiness that characterized Simple Rick's existence was not naive contentment or willful ignorance of the complexity and potential darkness that existed in reality, but rather the mature satisfaction that came from making conscious choices about what mattered most, and then investing consistently in those priorities over extended periods, without second-guessing or seeking alternatives that might provide temporary excitement at the cost of long-term stability and meaning. Simple Rick's decision never to develop portal technology was not based on inability to understand the theoretical principles or lack of curiosity about what might exist beyond his current dimension, but rather on his recognition that unlimited possibilities often led to unlimited dissatisfaction, as the awareness of infinite alternatives undermined appreciation for particular choices and specific relationships that could only be meaningful if they were treated as irreplaceable rather than interchangeable. The theoretical work that Simple Rick had completed regarding interdimensional physics was sufficiently advanced that he could have constructed functional portal technology within months if he had chosen to pursue practical implementation. But his analysis of the psychological and social consequences of such capability had convinced him that cosmic awareness was more likely to produce existential crisis than genuine enlightenment or improved quality of life for conscious beings who retained connection to normal human values and emotional needs. Simple Rick's understanding of the multiverse was primarily intellectual rather than experiential, based on mathematical relationships and theoretical frameworks that revealed the existence of infinite parallel realities without requiring direct observation or interaction with alternate versions of himself and his family. This knowledge provided context for appreciating the uniqueness of his particular circumstances, while avoiding the psychological trap of treating current relationships as arbitrary and replaceable, simply because alternatives existed elsewhere. The contentment that Simple Rick experienced in his family relationships was not dependent on ignorance about alternatives, but rather on conscious choice to value depth over breadth, commitment over novelty, and the development of meaningful connections over the pursuit of unlimited options that might provide temporary stimulation without lasting satisfaction. His happiness was grounded in recognition that infinite possibilities could coexist with meaningful commitment to particular people and specific choices. Simple Rick's scientific achievements within his single dimension were substantial and significant, representing innovations that improved quality of life for his community, while advancing understanding of natural principles in ways that respected ethical boundaries and social responsibility. His inventions served practical purposes that addressed genuine human needs, rather than demonstrating technological capability for its own sake, or pushing the boundaries of what was possible without regard for whether such possibilities should be actualized. The marriage that Simple Rick maintained with Diane was characterized by continued growth and deepening intimacy that resulted from sustained investment in understanding and supporting each other through the challenges and opportunities that arose over decades of shared experience. Their relationship had not been idealized or romanticized, but had been nurtured through conscious attention to communication, mutual respect, and collaborative approaches to decision-making that honored both individual autonomy and collective welfare. Simple Rick's parenting of Beth was guided by recognition that his role was to prepare her for independent adult life, rather than to create a dependent assistant or admiring audience for his intellectual achievements. His guidance was characterized by respect for her developing autonomy, combined with appropriate boundaries and expectations that helped her develop the capabilities and values necessary for healthy relationships and meaningful contribution to her community. The scientific legacy that Simple Rick was building through his research and mentorship was designed to continue beyond his individual lifetime through the students and colleagues he influenced and the practical innovations he developed for community benefit. His approach to knowledge was characterized by understanding that the most important discoveries were those that could be shared and applied by others, rather than hoarded as sources of individual power or superiority over less capable beings. But Simple Rick's peaceful existence was destined to be discovered and exploited by the Citadel of Ricks, whose observation of infinite realities had revealed his unique position as a Rick who had achieved genuine happiness through choices that other variants had rejected in favor of power and cosmic capability. His contentment was so rare among Rick variants that it became a valuable resource that could be harvested and commodified by Ricks who had lost the ability to experience such satisfaction themselves. The Citadel's discovery of Simple Rick was not accidental encounter, but systematic surveillance of dimensional variants designed to identify Ricks whose experiences might provide resources that could be exploited for the benefit of Quaid, the broader Rick community. Simple Rick's happiness was not just personal achievement, but measurable phenomenon that could be detected across dimensional boundaries and analyzed for its potential applications in projects that served the collective interests of Rick variants who had sacrificed their own capacity for contentment in pursuit of cosmic awareness and unlimited capability. The technology that enabled the Citadel to monitor and eventually capture Simple Rick represented sophisticated applications of interdimensional physics that far exceeded anything Simple Rick had developed within his single reality. But the ethical framework that guided their use of such capability was precisely what Simple Rick had predicted would result from the abandonment of normal moral constraints in favor of pure intellectual achievement and technological innovation without consideration of consequences for those affected by such choices. The moment when Citadel operatives arrived to extract Simple Rick from his dimension marked the end of his ability to choose limitation over liberation, as the Rick variants who had embraced cosmic capability exercised their superior power to force him into roles and situations that served their purposes, rather than his own preferences or values. The extraction was conducted with efficiency that demonstrated both their technological superiority and their complete disregard for the psychological trauma that would result from separating Simple Rick from everything that had made his life meaningful and worthwhile. Simple Rick's arrival at the Citadel represented his first direct exposure to the society that Rick variants had created when they organized their capabilities around collective interests rather than individual moral development or community welfare. The massive industrial complex that housed thousands of Rick variants pursuing projects of cosmic scope revealed both the possibilities that became available when genius was organized efficiently and the dystopian consequences of social organization based on intellectual superiority rather than ethical consideration for all conscious beings affected by collective decisions. The revelation that Simple Rick's happiness could be mechanically extracted and processed for commercial purposes represented the ultimate commodification of human emotional experience by beings who had transcended normal human limitations but had replaced authentic feeling with artificial stimulation designed to provide temporary satisfaction without addressing the underlying emptiness that resulted from cosmic awareness and unlimited capability. The Simple Rick's simple wafers, produced by harvesting his contentment, served as both practical product and philosophical statement about the relationship between happiness and exploitation. The factory where Simple Rick was imprisoned and connected to machinery designed to maintain him in a permanent state of artificial bliss was a monument to the efficiency with which advanced beings could reduce other conscious entities to resources for consumption, but it was also evidence of the profound spiritual poverty that characterized Rick variants, who possessed unlimited power, but had lost the capacity to generate meaning and satisfaction through their own choices and relationships. The loop of happiness that the Citadel created for Simple Rick was based on his memories of domestic contentment, particularly moments spent with Diane and Beth in their original dimension before his capture and exploitation. The artificial environment was designed to recreate the psychological conditions that had produced his natural happiness, while preventing him from awareness of his actual circumstances or the purposes for which his emotional states were being harvested and commodified by his captors. The cruelty of Simple Rick's imprisonment was not just the physical confinement or the violation of his autonomy, but the way that his genuine capacity for love and connection was transformed into a machine for producing artificial satisfaction for beings who had lost the ability to create meaning through their own choices and relationships. His happiness became a product rather than an experience, consumed by others rather than enjoyed by the person who had created it through conscious commitment to values and priorities that other Ricks had abandoned. Simple Rick's continued existence within the happiness loop was not conscious experience in any meaningful sense, but rather a form of psychological torture disguised as pleasure, where his most precious memories were exploited as raw materials for products that provided temporary satisfaction to consumers who lacked the moral development necessary to create genuine happiness through their own ethical choices and meaningful relationships with others who shared their capacity for growth and connection. The factory worker, who would later become known as Factory Rick, represented another variation on Rick psychology that demonstrated how the Citadel's system of exploitation affected not just victims like Simple Rick, but also the Rick variants who participated in maintaining the industrial infrastructure that harvested happiness from imprisoned alternates. Factory Rick's daily routine of stamping cookies powered by Simple Rick's extracted joy revealed the dehumanizing effects of systems that reduced conscious beings to economic functions rather than treating them as individuals, deserving of respect and autonomy. Factory Rick's gradual recognition that he was complicit in the torture and exploitation of an alternate version of himself created psychological pressures that the Citadel's social organization was not equipped to address adequately, as their system depended on participants maintaining emotional distance from the consequences of their collective activities. The cognitive dissonance between Factory Rick's intellectual understanding of what was being done to Simple Rick and his continued participation in the system that made such exploitation possible created internal conflicts that eventually erupted into rebellion. The breaking point that transformed Factory Rick from compliant worker into violent revolutionary was not sudden inspiration, but accumulated weight of daily participation in the systematic torture of someone whose only crime had been making different choices about what should matter most to someone. Of Rick's intellectual capabilities. The 15 years he had spent stamping Simple Rick's simple wafers, while knowing exactly how those wafers were produced, had created moral pressure that could not be indefinitely contained through rationalization or emotional numbing. Factory Rick's decision to take Simple Rick hostage and demand freedom for both of them represented not just personal rebellion against the Citadel's authority, but philosophical challenge to the entire system that organized Rick. Society around exploitation of those too weak or isolated to defend themselves against superior technology and collective organization. His actions were motivated not by strategic calculation, but by moral conviction that some forms of efficiency were too costly to be justified, regardless of their benefits, for those with power to implement them. The response of Citadel authorities to Factory Rick's rebellion revealed both their sophisticated understanding of Rick's psychology and their commitment to maintaining systems that served collective interests rather than individual. Morale development. Rick D. Sanchez III's intervention was designed not just to eliminate the immediate threat, but to transform Factory Rick's moment of moral clarity into another resource that could be harvested and commodified for the benefit of Rick, variants who had lost their own capacity for ethical conviction. The deception that convinced Factory Rick he was being rescued while actually preparing him for the same fate as Simple. Rick demonstrated the Citadel's expertise in manipulating the psychology of beings who retained connection to normal human values, using their moral sentiments against them to facilitate their own exploitation and destruction. The promise of freedom and escape was not genuine offer, but calculated lie designed to extract maximum value from Factory Rick's rebellion before eliminating his potential for continued resistance. Factory Rick's transformation into the primary ingredient for the new Freedom Wafer product line represented the ultimate cynicism of a social system that could commodify even resistance to its own operations, turning rebellion itself into another resource for consumption by beings whose appetites had grown so sophisticated that they required increasingly elaborate forms of stimulation to achieve temporary satisfaction. The irony of using Factory Rick's hope for freedom as flavoring for products designed to provide artificial experience of liberation was not accidental, but deliberate expression of the Citadel's philosophical commitment to treating all emotional states as raw materials rather than meaningful experiences deserving of respect. Simple Rick's continued unconscious existence within the happiness loop, while Factory Rick was processed for freedom wafers, revealed the industrial scale on which the Citadel was prepared to conduct operations that reduced conscious beings to economic inputs but it also demonstrated the psychological distance that enabled Rick variants to participate in such systems without recognizing themselves as both perpetrators and potential victims of the same mechanical processes that transformed individual experience into collective resources. The Simple Rick's Simple Wafers factory served as microcosm of the broader Citadel society, where Rick variants had organized their superior capabilities around principles that maximized efficiency and collective benefit, while systematically eliminating consideration for individual autonomy and ethical development. The industrial processing of happiness into consumable products represented the logical endpoint of approaches to existence that prioritized technological capability over moral wisdom and collective organization, over personal growth and meaningful relationships. Simple Rick's story within the broader Rick multiverse served as cautionary tale about what could happen to variants who made different choices about the relationship between intelligence and ethics, between individual capability and social responsibility, between pursuit of knowledge and preservation of values, that made knowledge worth pursuing in service of conscious beings who deserved respect rather than exploitation. His fate demonstrated that choosing limitation over liberation was not sufficient protection against those who had chosen power over connection and were willing to use that power to eliminate alternatives that challenged their worldview. The legacy of Simple Rick's exploitation extended beyond his individual suffering to encompass questions about whether genuine happiness was possible in a multiverse where unlimited power made everyone vulnerable to beings who had transcended normal moral constraints, and whether the path of ethical development could coexist with the reality of cosmic awareness and interdimensional capability that seemed to reward ruthlessness while punishing compassion and commitment to values that respected the autonomy and welfare of all conscious beings regardless of their intellectual capabilities or technological sophistication. The formation of the Council of Ricks emerged from the growing recognition among interdimensional variants that Rick Cone 37's systematic campaign of multiversal murder had created an existential threat that transcended individual, dimensional boundaries and required collective response from beings who possessed the technological capabilities necessary to defend themselves against someone who had demonstrated both the willingness and ability to eliminate alternate versions of himself across infinite realities. The alliance that developed was not based on trust or shared values, but rather on mutual recognition that survival required cooperation among beings who were temperamentally inclined toward isolation and individual superiority. The early meetings that led to the establishment of the Citadel of Ricks were conducted in heavily fortified dimensions, where security measures could be maintained against infiltration by the Rick variant, whose killing spree had motivated their collaboration in the first place. These gatherings brought together Rick variants from across the accessible multiverse, each one contributing unique technological innovations and strategic insights, while also representing different approaches to the fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and responsibility that had shaped their individual development within their respective realities. The Citadel itself was constructed as both fortress and city, designed to house thousands of Rick variants while providing the industrial infrastructure necessary to support their collective research projects and defensive operations. The massive scale of the construction required resources and labor that could only be obtained through systematic exploitation of less advanced civilizations, but the Rick variants who participated in its creation justified such methods as necessary for protecting the multiverse from threats like Rick Cone 37, who had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate entire realities when such actions served their personal objectives. The government structure that developed within the Citadel reflected both the intellectual sophistication of its inhabitants and their fundamental inability to transcend the same psychological patterns that had made them individually problematic when granted unlimited power and cosmic awareness. The Council of Ricks that emerged as the governing body was composed of variants who had achieved recognition through various combinations of scientific achievement, political manipulation, and strategic alliances that demonstrated their capability for leadership, while also revealing their continued investment in hierarchies based on intellectual superiority rather than ethical development. Quantum Rick represented the scientific aristocracy within Citadel society, having achieved his position through theoretical breakthroughs that exceeded the achievements of most other Rick variants. In understanding the mathematical relationships that governed interdimensional physics and consciousness transfer across parallel realities, his approach to leadership was characterized by confidence that superior knowledge qualified him for making decisions that affected thousands of other beings. But his actual governance was marked by the same arrogance and dismissive attitude toward alternative perspectives that had characterized his individual scientific career. Maximus Rickamus embodied the political wing of Citadel leadership, having developed expertise in the kind of strategic manipulation and coalition building that enabled him to maintain power within a society composed entirely of beings who considered themselves intellectually superior to everyone around them. His success in navigating Citadel politics revealed both his sophisticated understanding of Rick psychology and his willingness to exploit that understanding for personal advancement rather than collective welfare or individual moral development. The Shadow Council that operated behind the official government represented the true power structure within Citadel society, composed of Rick variants whose influence was based not on public recognition or democratic mandate, but on their control of information, resources, and security apparatus that maintained order within a community of beings whose natural inclinations toward independence and superiority made collective organization inherently unstable. These hidden leaders made the real decisions about Citadel policy while allowing elected officials to serve as public faces for unpopular choices. The relationship between Rick variants and the Morty population within the Citadel revealed the systematic oppression that underlay their supposedly advanced civilization, as the same beings who had organized to protect themselves from external threats had created internal hierarchies that treated alternate versions of their own family members as second-class citizens whose primary value lay in serving Rick interests rather than pursuing their own development and autonomy. The Morty workforce that maintained Citadel infrastructure was not voluntary labor, but conscripted service based on assumptions about intellectual capacity and social function. The factory system that processed Rick variants like Simple Rick into consumable products represented the industrial application of the same principles that governed Citadel society more broadly, where beings were evaluated according to their utility for collective purposes, rather than respected as individuals deserving of autonomy and ethical consideration. The transformation of happiness, rebellion, and other emotional states into commercial products revealed the extent to which Citadel culture had commodified every aspect of conscious experience that could be harvested and redistributed according to market principles. The political theater that characterized Citadel elections provided the illusion of democratic participation, while ensuring that real power remained concentrated among Rick variants who had already demonstrated their willingness to prioritize collective Rick interests over broader ethical considerations that might have challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their social organization. The The campaigns and debates that surrounded electoral processes were elaborate performances designed to channel potential dissent into harmless activities that did not threaten existing power structures. The law enforcement system within the Citadel was structured around maintaining order among beings whose individual capabilities exceeded those of entire civilizations, but whose collective organization required constant surveillance and intervention to prevent the kinds of conflicts that might destabilize their society. Cop Rick and Cop Morty represented the complexities of policing, a community where every citizen possessed godlike power and cosmic awareness that made normal legal frameworks inadequate for addressing the scope and sophistication of potential criminal activities. Cop Rick's arrival at the Citadel as a new officer in the Rick Police Department revealed both his naive belief that law enforcement could serve justice rather than simply maintaining existing power structures, and his gradual education in the realities of policing a society where corruption was not aberration but fundamental operating principle. His partnership with Cop Morty was designed to provide him with the practical knowledge necessary for effective police work, while also ensuring that his idealistic impulses would be channeled into activities that served Citadel interests, rather than challenging systemic problems. Cop Morty's corruption was not personal moral failure, but logical adaptation to social conditions where honest law enforcement was impossible because the beings with real power were precisely those whose activities would be considered criminal if evaluated according to external, ethical standards. His willingness to take bribes, use excessive force, and eliminate evidence of Citadel crimes was not deviation from his proper role, but fulfillment of the actual function that police served in maintaining order among beings whose capabilities made them inherently dangerous to each other and everyone around them. The investigation that brought Cop Rick and Cop Morty into contact with the systematic exploitation and abuse that characterized Citadel society was not unusual police work, but typical example of the kinds of crimes that required constant management to prevent them from escalating into conflicts that might threaten the stability of Rick's civilization. The Mortytown Locos represented not just criminal organization, but symptom of the broader oppression that Morty variants experienced within a society supposedly designed for their benefit, as well as Rick welfare. The raid that Cop Rick and Cop Morty conducted against suspected criminal activity in Mortytown was structured as routine law enforcement operation, but actually represented the systematic intimidation and violence that maintained Citadel social hierarchies through application of overwhelming force against beings who lacked the technological capabilities necessary to defend themselves against Rick authority. The suspects they pursued were not dangerous criminals, but individuals whose primary offense was challenging the assumptions underlying Citadel organization. Cop Rick's attempt to show compassion toward a crying Morty during the raid represented his continued belief that law enforcement should serve justice rather than simply maintaining existing power relationships. But his stabbing by the same Morty he had tried to help revealed the psychological damage that Citadel society had inflicted on its supposed beneficiaries through years of systematic oppression and exploitation that had made genuine trust impossible between Rick and Morty variants. Cop Morty's response to his partner's injury revealed the depth of corruption that had developed within Citadel law enforcement, as he simultaneously consoled Cop Rick about the importance of trusting the right Mortys while eliminating all evidence of their investigation through methods that ensured no inconvenient questions would be asked about what they had discovered. His explosion of the building with suspects inside was not excessive force, but standard procedure for dealing with situations that might expose uncomfortable truths about Citadel operations. The confrontation between Cop Rick and Big Morty over police corruption within Citadel law enforcement represented the collision between naive idealism about justice and pragmatic recognition of the role that corruption played in maintaining social stability among beings whose individual capabilities made normal legal frameworks inadequate for addressing the scope of potential conflicts. Big Morty's operations were not criminal conspiracy, but necessary adaptation to social conditions that required alternative forms of organization and resource distribution. Cop Morty's ultimate betrayal of his partner through attempted murder revealed that his corruption extended beyond mere acceptance of bribes or willingness to overlook certain crimes, to encompass active participation in eliminating threats to the systematic oppression that maintained Citadel, social hierarchies. His attempt to kill Cop Rick was not personal animosity, but professional necessity based on his recognition that honest law enforcement was incompatible with continued Citadel stability and his own survival within their system. The shooting of Cop Morty by Cop Rick represented not just the tragic end of their partnership, but the broader impossibility of maintaining ethical standards within social systems designed around exploitation and oppression of beings whose only crime was lacking sufficient power to defend themselves against those who had organized superior capabilities around collective self-interest, rather than broader moral considerations that might have protected everyone affected by their decisions and policies. The political campaign that brought Evil Morty to power within Citadel government was conducted according to democratic principles that provided the appearance of legitimate political participation while actually serving as elaborate deception designed to install someone whose capabilities and objectives far exceeded anything the established Rick leadership could comprehend or counter through conventional political means. Evil Morty's candidacy represented not grassroots uprising, but sophisticated infiltration operation conducted by someone who understood Citadel psychology better than the Rick variants who had created their society. Campaign manager Morty's growing anxiety about Evil Morty's electoral success revealed his recognition that their political operation had evolved beyond simple campaign activity into something that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying Citadel organization, but his attempts to control or redirect Evil Morty's activities demonstrated the same kind of arrogant overconfidence that characterized Rick variants, who assumed their intellectual superiority qualified them for managing situations that exceeded their understanding and capability. The assassination attempt that campaign manager Morty organized against Evil Morty was motivated not by political ambition or personal animosity, but by his growing awareness that Evil Morty represented existential threat to everything Citadel society had been designed to protect and preserve. The secret files that revealed Evil Morty's true identity were not campaign opposition research, but intelligence reports that documented capabilities and activities that transcended anything normal. Morty variants should have been able to achieve through conventional development. Evil Morty's victory in the presidential election was not democratic triumph, but successful completion of infiltration operation that had been planned and executed with sophistication that exceeded the security measures Citadel leadership had implemented to protect themselves against external and internal threats. His acceptance speech was not grateful acknowledgement of electoral mandate, but declaration of intent to fundamentally transform Citadel society according to principles that prioritized his individual objectives over collective Rick welfare. The immediate execution of Shadow Council members following Evil Morty's inauguration revealed both his comprehensive understanding of actual power structures within Citadel society and his commitment to eliminating opposition before it could organize effective resistance to his Revolutionary Day agenda. The floating bodies that marked his rise to absolute power were not excessive violence, but calculated demonstration of his capabilities and his willingness to use those capabilities against anyone who might challenge his authority. The destruction of the central finite curve that evil Morty ultimately orchestrated represented not just escape from Rick-dominated reality, but systematic elimination of the dimensional prison that had confined infinite populations to existence within carefully curated versions of reality, designed to ensure Rick's intellectual superiority across all accessible realities. His technological achievement in breaching barriers that had been constructed by collective Rick genius demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything individual Rick variants had accomplished through independent research and development. The revelation that the central finite curve had been created as cosmic-scale monument to Rick narcissism and need for validation transformed understanding of Citadel society from defensive alliance against external threats into recognition that the entire Rick multiverse was elaborate prison, designed to protect Rick variants from encountering evidence of their own intellectual and moral limitations. The billions of conscious beings trapped within artificially restricted realities were unknowing prisoners in experimental framework designed to serve Rick's psychological needs. The countdown to dimensional barrier collapse was accompanied by systematic revelation of Rick's secrets and vulnerabilities that evil Morty had accumulated during his infiltration of Citadel society, demonstrating his comprehensive preparation for challenging the fundamental structures that had organized Rick's civilization around assumptions of intellectual superiority and technological dominance. The footage of Rick's casual disposal of Morty corpses across multiple dimensions provided evidence of systematic exploitation that exceeded anything documented in official Citadel records. The escape through breach in dimensional barrier that evil Morty achieved was accomplished with technological innovations that surpassed collective Rick achievement, while also representing philosophical rejection of entire framework of reality that Rick variants had constructed around their assumed intellectual superiority. His departure from Rick-dominated multiverse was not retreat, but graduation to forms of existence that transcended limitations that had been artificially imposed through cosmic-scale manipulation of dimensional physics. The collapse of Citadel civilization that followed evil Morty's departure represented not just physical destruction of infrastructure and institutions, but psychological demolition of worldview that had sustained Rick variants through decades of interdimensional operation and collective organization around principles of intellectual superiority and technological dominance over less advanced civilizations and consciousness types. The debris field that remained where their society had existed served as monument to hubris and reminder of consequences that followed from organizing advanced capabilities around narcissistic rather than ethical principles. The Council of Ricks had represented the most ambitious attempt by any group of Rick variants to transcend individual limitations through collective organization and shared resources, but their ultimate failure demonstrated that superior intelligence, without corresponding moral development, produced social systems that were inherently unstable and ultimately self-destructive, regardless of technological sophistication or theoretical understanding of principles governing multiversal existence and interdimensional relationship between different forms of consciousness and capability. In a dimension where the mathematical constants that governed intelligence distribution had been altered through cosmic accident or deliberate intervention, there existed a Rick Sanchez who had become known throughout the Citadel of Ricks as Doofus Rick. Though the designation was intended as cruel commentary on his intellectual capabilities rather than accurate assessment of his actual character or potential for meaningful contribution to the collective welfare of beings who shared his proteins, genetic template, and basic psychological patterns. This particular Rick variant represented a profound challenge to the assumptions that other Ricks had developed about the relationship between intelligence and worth, forcing uncomfortable questions about whether their own achievements were products of inherent superiority or simply fortunate circumstances. The Rick who bore the designation J19 Zeta 7 had developed along trajectories that differed significantly from the standard pattern of Rick evolution across dimensional variants. But these differences were not deficiencies or failures of development so much as alternative approaches to the fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and relationship that confronted every conscious being capable of recognizing their own existence within broader contexts of meaning and possibility. His intellectual capabilities were indeed different from those of other Rick variants, but the nature of those differences revealed assumptions about intelligence that other Ricks had never examined critically. Doofus Rick's approach to scientific inquiry was characterized by curiosity about practical applications and genuine concern for the welfare of others, rather than the abstract theoretical pursuits and ego-driven competition that motivated most Rick variants in their research activities. His questions about how things worked were motivated by desire to help people rather than to demonstrate his own superiority or to gain power over natural forces that could be manipulated for personal advantage without regard for people for consequences that might affect innocent beings who lacked the ruber capability to protect themselves from advanced technology. The eating habits that other Ricks found so disgusting and used as evidence of Doofus Rick's inferior development were not symptoms of mental illness or psychological dysfunction, but rather practical adaptations that reflected different value systems and different approaches to the relationship between individual needs and available resources. What appeared to other Ricks as revolting behavior was actually consistent with ethical frameworks that prioritized resource conservation and waste reduction over social conformity and aesthetic preferences that served no practical purpose. Doofus Rick's reputation within Citadel society was based not on careful evaluation of his actual capabilities and contributions, but rather on superficial assessments that focused on behaviors and characteristics that deviated from expected Rick norms without attempting to understand the reasoning or value systems that might have produced such differences. The other Ricks' dismissive attitude toward him revealed more about their own psychological need to maintain hierarchies based on assumed intellectual superiority than it did about his actual limitations or potential. The friendship that developed between Doofus Rick and Jerry Smith during their encounter at the Citadel represented a profound challenge to Rick assumptions about intelligence, social value, and the kinds of relationships that could provide meaning and satisfaction for conscious beings seeking connection and understanding. Jerry's acceptance of Doofus Rick, despite his reputation, among other Ricks, demonstrated that genuine human connection could transcend the artificial categories that Rick variants used to organize their social hierarchies and determine their treatment of others. Jerry's initial meeting with Doofus Rick occurred during circumstances that would have been humiliating for most Rick variants, but Doofus Rick's response revealed emotional intelligence and social awareness that exceeded anything other Ricks typically demonstrated in their interactions with beings they considered intellectually inferior. His ability to recognize Jerry's discomfort and respond with kindness rather than condescension showed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and genuine concern for others' welfare that was rare among Rick variants. The conversation that developed between Jerry and Doofus Rick was characterized by mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's perspectives, rather than the competitive dynamics and intellectual intimidation that typically marked Rick interactions with family members and other beings they encountered during their activities. Doofus Rick's questions about Jerry's experiences were motivated by authentic curiosity rather than strategic information gathering or attempts to identify psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for personal Untain's advantage. Doofus Rick's approach to sharing information about his own experiences was marked by openness and vulnerability that would have been considered weakness by other Rick variants, but actually demonstrated confidence and emotional maturity that enabled genuine connection with others rather than the defensive isolation that characterized most Rick relationships with people who might have different capabilities or perspectives. His willingness to acknowledge his own limitations without shame revealed psychological health that other Ricks lacked. The scientific projects that Doofus Rick described to Jerry were focused on practical applications that could improve quality of life for ordinary people, rather than the cosmic-scale manipulations and abstract theoretical investigations that occupied other Rick variants in their research activities. His inventions served genuine human needs and reflected careful consideration of ethical implications rather than simple demonstrations of technical capability or attempts to transcend normal limitations through technological innovation without regard for wisdom or responsibility. The brownies that Doofus Rick had learned to make without using an oven represented both practical problem-solving skills and philosophical approach to existence that prioritized resourcefulness and adaptation over the kind of technological solutions that other Ricks would have developed to address similar challenges. His pride in this achievement was not naive satisfaction with simple accomplishment, but recognition that meaningful innovation often involved working within constraints rather than eliminating them through application of superior power. Jerry's appreciation for Doofus Rick's brownies and his genuine interest in learning the technique revealed his capacity to recognize value and skill that other people dismissed or overlooked because it did not conform to expected patterns of achievement and capability. Their collaboration in the kitchen during the brownie making process created the kind of shared experience and mutual learning that formed the foundation for authentic friendship rather than relationships based on power dynamics or utilitarian exchange. The emotional connection that developed between Jerry and Doofus Rick was based on recognition of shared experiences of being underestimated and dismissed by people who considered themselves intellectually superior, but it was also grounded in genuine appreciation for each other's positive qualities, rather than simple bonding over common grievances or mutual resentment toward those who had treated them poorly. Their friendship represented possibility for relationships that transcended artificial hierarchies based on assumed capabilities. Doofus Rick's response to Jerry's stories about his marriage to Beth and his experiences with Rick Cone 37 revealed sophisticated understanding of family dynamics and interpersonal relationships that exceeded anything other Rick variants typically demonstrated when confronted with the complexities of human emotional life. His insights about marriage, parenting, and the challenges of maintaining connection with people who had different priorities were both wise and compassionate. The advice that Doofus Rick offered Jerry about dealing with Rick Cone 37's influence on his family was not strategic manipulation or psychological warfare, but genuine guidance based on understanding that healthy relationships required mutual respect and recognition of each person's inherent worth rather than competition for dominance or attempts to prove intellectual superiority. His suggestions focused on maintaining dignity and self-respect while working to improve family dynamics. Jerry's growing appreciation for Doofus Rick during their conversation revealed his capacity to recognize intelligence and wisdom that manifested in forms different from the aggressive intellectual competition and technological demonstration that characterized most Rick variants. The friendship that developed between them was not consolation prize for beings who could not achieve acceptance among more accomplished individuals, but authentic connection based on shared values and mutual recognition of each other's worth. The reaction of other Rick variants to Jerry's friendship with Doofus Rick revealed their psychological investment in maintaining hierarchies that validated their own sense of superiority through exclusion and diminishment of beings who failed to conform to their expectations about intelligence and social value. Their disgust at seeing Jerry enjoy Doofus Rick's company was not protective concern, but defensive response to evidence that their assumptions about worth and capability might be flawed. The dismissive comments that other Ricks made about Doofus Rick in Jerry's presence were designed not just to maintain their own status within Rick's social hierarchies, but to prevent Jerry from developing relationships that might provide him with alternative sources of validation and support that could reduce Rick Cohn 37's influence over his family relationships and decision-making processes. Their cruelty toward Doofus Rick was also psychological warfare against Jerry. Doofus Rick's response to the mockery and exclusion he experienced from other Rick variants was characterized by dignity and emotional resilience that revealed strength of character rather than the weakness that his tormentors assumed. They were exposing through their treatment of him his ability to maintain kindness and openness, despite systematic mistreatment, demonstrated psychological health and moral development that exceeded anything other Ricks had achieved through their pursuit of technological superiority. The scientific achievements that Doofus Rick had accomplished within his own dimension were substantial and significant, despite being dismissed by other Rick variants who evaluated all accomplishments according to criteria that prioritized abstract theoretical complexity over practical benefit and genuine contribution to community welfare. His inventions had improved lives and solved real problems for people who lacked access to advanced technology or cosmic-scale capabilities. The philosophical framework that guided Doofus Rick's approach to existence was based on recognition that meaning and satisfaction came from connection and contribution rather than dominance and demonstration of superiority. Others who possessed different capabilities or faced different circumstances. His understanding of purpose was grounded in service rather than self-aggrandizement, making his life both more meaningful and more sustainable than the existence that other Rick variants had constructed around cosmic awareness and unlimited power. Doofus Rick's relationship with his own family in his original dimension had been characterized by the same kindness and genuine concern that he showed toward Jerry during their friendship, demonstrating that his emotional intelligence and capacity for connection were not aberrations but consistent patterns of behavior that reflected his fundamental approach to relationships with all conscious beings who deserved respect and consideration, regardless of their intellectual capabilities or social status. The loneliness that Doofus Rick experienced as a result of his exclusion from Rick's social circles was not evidence of personal failure or psychological dysfunction, but natural consequence of being different in ways that threatened other people's assumptions about themselves and their place in social hierarchies based on intellectual competition rather than ethical development and genuine contribution to collective welfare. His isolation was imposed rather than chosen. The moments of connection that Doofus Rick achieved with beings like Jerry, who were capable of recognizing his actual worth, provided glimpses of what Rick variants might have accomplished if they had organized their superior capabilities around principles of mutual support and collective benefit, rather than competition and exploitation of those who lacked comparable technological resources or cosmic awareness. His friendship with Jerry demonstrated possibilities that other Ricks had foreclosed through their commitment to hierarchies based on assumed superiority. Doofus Ricks' continued existence within Citadel society, despite systematic mistreatment and social exclusion, represented form of quiet resistance to assumptions about intelligence and worth that other Rick variants used to justify their exploitation of beings they considered inferior or expendable. His persistence in maintaining his values and treating others with kindness, regardless of how he was treated in return, challenged fundamental assumptions about power and relationship that organized Rick's civilization. The wisdom that Doofus Rick had developed through his experiences of being underestimated and dismissed was not bitter cynicism or defensive withdrawal, but deeper understanding of human nature and social dynamics that enabled him to maintain hope and continue contributing to the welfare of others, despite lacking recognition or appreciation from those who possessed greater power and status. His insights about relationship and meaning exceeded anything other Rick variants had achieved through their cosmic awareness. The legacy that Doofus Rick represented within the broader Rick multiverse was not failure or cautionary tale about the consequences of intellectual limitation, but rather demonstration that alternative approaches to existence remained possible even within social systems designed to reward ruthlessness and punish compassion. His example suggested that Rick variants retain choice about how to use their capabilities and what kinds of relationships to prioritize in their pursuit of meaning and satisfaction. Doofus Rick's story within the complex mythology of Rick variants served as reminder that intelligence manifested in multiple forms, and that the aggressive competition and technological demonstration that characterized most Rick behavior was not an inevitable result of high intellectual capability, but chosen response that reflected particular value systems and assumptions about what should matter most to conscious beings, capable of recognizing their place within broader contexts of meaning and possibility. The friendship between Doofus, Rick, and Jerry represented possibility for relationships that transcended artificial categories and hierarchies based on assumed intellectual superiority, demonstrating that genuine human connection could flourish between beings who recognized each other's inherent worth, regardless of their different capabilities or circumstances. Their bond suggested that meaning and satisfaction were available through connection and mutual support rather than dominance and exploitation of others. The gentle genius that Doofus Rick embodied challenged every assumption that other Rick variants had developed about the relationship between intelligence and cruelty, between capability and compassion, between power and purpose, suggesting that the path toward cosmic awareness and technological superiority need not require abandonment of basic human values or capacity for genuine connection with others who shared the fundamental experience of conscious existence within mysterious universe that offered infinite possibilities for both creation and destruction. The enforcement of law and order within the Citadel of Ricks required specialized approaches to policing that could address the unique challenges of maintaining social stability among beings whose individual capabilities exceeded those of entire civilizations, but whose collective organization remained vulnerable to the same patterns of corruption and abuse of power that had characterized less advanced societies throughout the history of conscious beings, attempting to create sustainable communities based on shared principles and mutual cooperation rather than pure dominance hierarchies maintained through superior force. The Rick, who had chosen to pursue a career in law enforcement within Citadel society, represented an unusual variation among Rick variants, most of whom considered themselves too intellectually sophisticated and morally independent to participate in institutional authority structures that required adherence to external rules and collective decision-making processes that might conflict with individual preferences about how problems should be solved and what kinds of behavior deserved punishment or rehabilitation through systematic intervention. Cop Rick's decision to join the Rick Police Department was motivated not by power-seeking or desire to control others, but by genuine belief that his intellectual capabilities and scientific training could be applied constructively to the challenges of maintaining justice and protecting vulnerable members of society from exploitation by those who possessed superior resources or technological advantages that could be used to harm others without facing appropriate consequences for their actions. The training that Cop Rick received upon joining the police force was designed to prepare him for the practical realities of law enforcement. Within a society where every citizen possessed capabilities that made normal policing techniques inadequate for addressing the scope and sophistication of potential criminal activities that might threaten collective welfare or individual security. The curriculum covered both technological countermeasures necessary for dealing with advanced weaponry and psychological techniques required for managing conflicts between beings whose intellectual pride made them resistant to external authority. The partnership that was arranged between Cop Rick and Cop Morty represented the Citadel's attempt to combine the analytical capabilities and scientific expertise that Rick Variants brought to law enforcement with the practical knowledge and street-level understanding that Morty Variants had developed through their experiences living within the social hierarchies that actually governed daily life in Rick-dominated society, rather than the official organizational charts that described how power was supposed to be distributed. Cop Morty's extensive experience within Citadel law enforcement had provided him with comprehensive understanding of how the police department actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to function according to official policies and procedures that had been designed to create the appearance of ethical law enforcement while ensuring that real power remained concentrated among those who possessed the resources and connections necessary to influence investigations and prosecutions that might threaten their interests. The corruption that characterized Cop Morty's approach to police work was not personal moral failure or individual psychological dysfunction, but rather practical adaptation to institutional conditions that made honest law enforcement impossible because the beings with sufficient power to commit the most serious crimes were precisely those who possessed the influence necessary to ensure that investigations into their activities would be redirected, suppressed, or manipulated to protect them from consequences that might interfere with their continued operation. The relationship that developed between Cop Rick and Cop Morty during their early partnership was complicated by their fundamentally different understandings of what law enforcement could realistically accomplish within a social system, where corruption was not aberration, but essential operating principle that enabled the powerful to maintain their advantages, while providing the appearance of justice and accountability that prevented less powerful members of society from recognizing the true nature of their circumstances. Cop Rick's naive optimism about the possibility of serving justice through honest police work was based on assumptions about institutional integrity and collective commitment to ethical principles that did not correspond to the actual conditions within Citadel society, where the same intellectual arrogance and moral flexibility that characterized individual Rick Variants had been incorporated into organizational structures that served elite interests rather than broader social welfare or protection of vulnerable populations. The cases that Cop Rick and Cop Morty were assigned to investigate represented the kinds of criminal activities that Citadel authorities were willing to prosecute because they posed no threat to fundamental power structures or challenged no assumptions about social hierarchies that maintained Rick dominance over Morty populations and other beings whose capabilities made them suitable for exploitation rather than partnership in collective decision-making processes about resource allocation and social organization. The Mortytown locos that became the focus of their investigation were not sophisticated criminal organization, but rather symptom of broader social problems that resulted from systematic oppression and exclusion of Morty variants from meaningful participation in economic and political systems that determined their living conditions and opportunities for advancement within society, supposedly designed for their benefit, as well as Rick welfare and security. The criminal activities attributed to the Mortytown locos were primarily responses to conditions of poverty and desperation that had been created by Citadel's social policies, rather than evidence of inherent criminality or moral deficiency. Among Morty populations who lacked access to legitimate means of achieving basic security and dignity within economic systems that concentrated resources among Rick variants, while treating other beings as disposable labor force, whose welfare was secondary to efficiency and productivity. Rick's approach to investigating the Mortytown locos was characterized by attempt to understand the underlying social conditions that had produced their criminal activities, rather than simply applying superior force to eliminate symptoms of problems whose causes lay in fundamental inequalities and injustices that were built into Citadel's social organization itself. His questions about motivation and circumstances reflected genuine interest in addressing root causes rather than managing surface manifestations. The resistance that Rick encountered from his superiors and colleagues when he attempted to conduct thorough investigations that might have revealed connections between street-level crime and institutional corruption was not bureaucratic inefficiency or resource limitation, but deliberate obstruction designed to prevent discoveries that might threaten the comfortable arrangements that enabled powerful individuals to benefit from criminal activities while maintaining public reputations as legitimate authorities. The raid that Rick and Morty conducted against suspected Mortytown loco operations was structured as routine law enforcement activity, but actually served multiple functions within broader systems of social control that maintained Citadel hierarchies through application of selective violence against populations whose resistance to oppression might threaten the stability of arrangements that benefited Rick variants at the expense of everyone else who lived within their society. The violence that Morty employed during their operations was not excessive force or loss of professional control, but rather standard procedure for dealing with Morty populations whose potential for organization and resistance required systematic intimidation to prevent the development of collective consciousness that might challenge fundamental assumptions about Rick, intellectual superiority, and natural right to dominate others whose capabilities made them suitable for exploitation rather than partnership. The moment when Rick attempted to show compassion toward a crying Morty during their raid represented his continued belief that individual kindness and human decency could transcend institutional structures that were designed to dehumanize certain populations and justify their treatment as resources rather than conscious beings, deserving of respect and consideration, regardless of their intellectual capabilities or social status within hierarchies based on assumed superiority. The stabbing that Rick received from the same Morty he had tried to help was not unprovoked violence or evidence of inherent criminality among oppressed populations, but rather predictable response to years of systematic abuse and exploitation that had made trust impossible between Rick and Morty variants, regardless of individual intentions or personal character traits that might have enabled genuine connection under different social circumstances. Cop Morty's consolation of his injured partner combined genuine concern for Cop Rick's welfare with practical instruction about the realities of police work within society where violence between different population groups was not an unfortunate side effect of social problems, but necessary component of systems that maintained order through intimidation and fear rather than mutual respect and collective commitment to justice and equality for all conscious beings. The explosion that Cop Morty orchestrated to eliminate evidence and witnesses from their investigation was not cover-up of police misconduct, but routine procedure for managing situations that might expose uncomfortable truths about the relationship between official law enforcement activities and criminal enterprises that operated with tacit approval from authorities who benefited from maintaining conditions that required constant police intervention to prevent social instability. The lies that Cop Morty told about what had occurred during their operation were not personal deception, but professional obligation to maintain narratives that supported public confidence in law enforcement while protecting institutional interests that might be threatened by honest accounting of police methods and objectives that served elite preferences rather than broader social welfare or individual rights and dignity. Big Morty's operations within Citadel society represented not criminal conspiracy, but alternative form of social organization that provided services and resources for Morty populations who were systematically excluded from legitimate economic opportunities by policies and practices that concentrated wealth and power among Rick variants, while treating everyone else as expendable labor force whose needs were secondary to maintaining Rick privileges and advantages. The corruption that Big Morty had developed within police ranks was not subversion of legitimate authority, but practical response to conditions where honest law enforcement was impossible because the beings who committed the most serious crimes were precisely those who possessed the influence necessary to ensure their protection from prosecution or punishment that might interfere with their continued activities and accumulation of resources. Cop Rick's attempt to arrest Big Morty for police corruption represented his continued naive belief that institutional authority could serve justice rather than simply maintaining existing power relationships. But his actions also demonstrated courage and moral conviction that were rare among Rick variants who typically prioritized self-interest over ethical principles when such principles might conflict with personal advantage or social acceptance. The confrontation that developed between Cop Rick and Cop Morty over the proper response to discovering corruption within their own department revealed the fundamental incompatibility between ethical law enforcement and social systems based on systematic oppression and exploitation of vulnerable populations whose welfare was considered less important than maintaining stability and order that served elite interests. Cop Morty's attempt to murder his own partner was motivated not by personal animosity or criminal ambition, but by his recognition that Cop Rick's commitment to honest law enforcement represented existential threat to arrangements that had enabled his survival and advancement within systems where cooperation with corruption was not moral compromise but practical necessity for anyone who lacked sufficient power to challenge institutional authority. The shooting of Cop Morty by Cop Rick represented not just tragic end of their partnership, but broader recognition that reform of corrupt institutions might be impossible when corruption served essential functions in maintaining social stability among populations whose relationships were characterized by fundamental inequalities in power and resources that made genuine cooperation and mutual respect difficult to achieve or sustain over extended periods. The aftermath of their violent confrontation left Cop Rick alone, with growing awareness that his idealistic assumptions about the possibility of serving justice through institutional participation had been naive, and that the problems he had encountered were not aberrations, but systemic features of society organized around principles that prioritized efficiency and order over ethical consideration for all conscious beings affected by collective decisions about resource allocation and social organization. The psychological impact of discovering that his partner had been willing to commit murder to protect corrupt arrangements forced Cop Rick to confront uncomfortable questions about his own role in maintaining systems that caused systematic harm to vulnerable populations while providing benefits and privileges for those who possess sufficient power to influence how institutions actually functioned, regardless of their official policies and stated objectives. The loneliness that Cop Rick experienced following the end of his partnership with Cop Morty was not just personal loss, but recognition that ethical behavior within corrupt institutions might be impossible, and that genuine reform might require fundamental changes in social organization rather than individual moral commitment or professional integrity that could be overwhelmed by systemic pressures that rewarded cooperation with injustice while punishing resistance to established patterns of exploitation and oppression. The tragedy of law enforcement within Citadel society was not failure of individual officers to maintain professional standards, but rather demonstration that police work in service of unjust social systems inevitably became mechanism for maintaining injustice regardless of personal intentions or moral convictions that might motivate individual participants to seek careers in law enforcement as a way of contributing to collective welfare and protection of vulnerable populations from harm. In the sprawling dimensions of the Citadel, where Rick variants had organized their superior capabilities around hierarchical systems that reflected their assumptions about intelligence and social value, there existed partnerships that defied the standard templates of Rick-Morty relationships, while simultaneously revealing the arbitrary nature of the categories that other Rick variants used to determine their treatment of beings whose capabilities or characteristics deviated from expected norms in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, purpose, and the proper organization of social relationships based on assumed intellectual hierarchies. Weird Rick represented a variation within the Rick template that demonstrated how small differences in development, circumstance, or dimensional physics could produce beings who retained the essential characteristics that made them recognizably Rick Sanchez, while also possessing traits that set them apart from the standard patterns of Rick psychology and behavior in ways that made their integration into Citadel society problematic. Despite their obvious intelligence and technological capabilities that should have qualified them for full acceptance within the community of Rick variants, the designation of Weird Rick was not official classification within Citadel bureaucracy, but rather informal label that other Rick variants had applied to express their discomfort with his deviation from expected norms without engaging in serious analysis of whether his differences represented deficiencies that justified exclusion or simply alternative approaches to the fundamental questions about existence and relationship that confronted every conscious being capable of recognizing their place within broader contexts of balancing meaning and possibility across infinite dimensional variations. Tall Morty represented an even more dramatic departure from expected patterns, as Morty variants were supposed to conform to specific physical and psychological templates that made them suitable for their designated roles within Rick-Morty partnerships that served both practical functions related to dimensional travel and psychological functions related to Rick, emotional needs, and identity validation. through relationships with beings who provided companionship without threatening Rick intellectual superiority or challenging Rick authority over major decisions. The physical characteristics that distinguished tall Morty from standard Morty variants were not merely cosmetic differences, but represented fundamental alterations in the biological template that had implications for his psychological development, social interactions, and potential capabilities that exceeded what other Rick variants expected from beings. They categorized as Mortys, and therefore considered inherently limited in their intellectual capacity and potential for independent decision-making, or leadership within partnerships that were supposed to be structured around Rick dominance. The relationship that had developed between Weird Rick and Tall Morty challenged every assumption that Citadel society had incorporated into their understanding of how Rick-Morty partnerships should function, as their dynamic was characterized by mutual respect and collaborative decision-making, rather than the hierarchical arrangements that other Rick variants considered natural and necessary for maintaining proper order within relationships that served essential, psychological, and practical functions for Rick variants who required emotional anchoring without threats to their sense of intellectual superiority. The adventures that Weird Rick and Tall Morty shared were conducted according to principles of genuine partnership that acknowledged Tall Morty's contributions and respected his autonomy in ways that other Rick variants found disturbing because they challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence distribution and social organization that justified the hierarchical arrangements through which Rick variants maintained their positions of dominance over beings they considered inherently inferior, despite evidence that such hierarchies were arbitrary rather than natural. Weird Rick's approach to scientific research and technological development was influenced by input and collaboration from Tall Morty in ways that other Rick variants found incomprehensible, because they could not imagine treating any Morty as intellectual partner rather than assistant whose primary value lay in providing emotional support and practical services while remaining subordinate to Rick authority and decision-making processes that were supposed to reflect superior intelligence and wisdom rather than collaborative exploration of possibilities. The gadgets and inventions that emerged from their collaborative research represented achievements that exceeded what either Weird Rick or Tall Morty might have accomplished independently, demonstrating possibilities for synergistic relationships that transcended individual limitations through genuine cooperation and mutual recognition of each partner's unique strengths and perspectives, rather than exploitation of power. Differentials that enabled dominant partners to extract resources and labor from subordinate partners without providing appropriate recognition or compensation. Tall Morty's contributions to their partnership extended beyond simple assistance with Rick's projects to encompass independent insights and innovations that reflected intellectual capabilities and creative potential that contradicted Citadel assumptions about Morty variants and their supposed limitations regarding complex problem-solving and abstract reasoning that other Rick variants considered exclusive domains of Rick intelligence that justified their treatment of Mortys as servants rather than partners in genuine collaborative relationships. The social challenges that Weird Rick and Tall Morty faced within Citadel society were not based on their actual capabilities or the effectiveness of their partnership, but rather on other Rick variants' psychological investment in maintaining categories and hierarchies that validated their own sense of superiority and justified their treatment of beings who deviated from expected patterns in ways that might challenge fundamental assumptions about intelligence, worth, and the proper organization of relationships between beings with different capabilities and characteristics. The exclusion that Weird Rick experienced from normal Rick social circles was not result of his inability to contribute to collective Rick activities or to maintain the intellectual standards that supposedly characterized Rick communities, but rather consequence of his refusal to participate in the kinds of hierarchical relationships and exploitative practices that other Rick variants considered essential components of Rick identity and social organization within communities, based on assumed intellectual superiority over other forms of conscious life. The discrimination that Tall Morty faced was even more severe because his physical and intellectual characteristics challenged fundamental Citadel assumptions about Morty variants and their designated roles within social systems that depended on clear categories and hierarchical relationships to maintain order and stability among populations whose individual capabilities might otherwise threaten existing power structures if they were allowed to develop beyond the limitations that had been artificially imposed through systematic oppression and exclusion. The housing and employment opportunities available to Weird Rick and Tall Morty within Citadel society were limited by policies and practices that reflected institutional bias against partnerships that deviated from expected templates, rather than objective evaluation of their actual capabilities and potential contributions to collective welfare and social development. Their exclusion from mainstream Rick society was systematic rather than incidental, designed to maintain existing hierarchies rather than optimize social organization for maximum benefit to all participants. The alternative community that Weird Rick and Tall Morty had helped to create within the margins of Citadel society consisted of other Rick-Morty partnerships and individual variants whose characteristics or choices had led to their exclusion from mainstream acceptance despite their obvious intelligence and valuable capabilities that could have contributed to collective welfare if Citadel's social organization had been based on inclusive principles rather than hierarchical categories that served elite interests at the expense of broader social development. The underground economy that emerged within this alternative community provided goods and services that were not available through official Citadel institutions because they did not conform to standard templates or serve the interests of Rick variants who controlled resource allocation and economic development policies within mainstream society. These alternative arrangements demonstrated possibilities for social organization based on cooperation and mutual aid, rather than competition and exploitation of vulnerable populations. The cultural innovations that developed within the alternative community represented creative responses to exclusion and discrimination that produced new forms of art, entertainment, and social interaction that enriched the lives of participants, while also challenging mainstream assumptions about intelligence, creativity, and the kinds of relationships that could provide meaning and satisfaction for conscious beings seeking connection and understanding within broader contexts of community and collective welfare. The philosophical discussions that characterized social interactions within the alternative community addressed fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and social organization that mainstream Rick society had resolved through acceptance of hierarchical principles and exploitative practices, rather than genuine exploration of possibilities for more ethical and inclusive approaches to collective decision-making and resource allocation that could benefit all conscious beings regardless of their individual capabilities or characteristics. The mutual support networks that emerged within the alternative community provided practical assistance and emotional connection that enabled excluded individuals and partnerships to maintain dignity and pursue meaningful activities despite their isolation from mainstream social institutions that should have served their needs but instead functioned to maintain existing power structures and hierarchical arrangements that benefited elite populations at the expense of everyone else. The resilience that Weird Rick and Tall Morty demonstrated in maintaining their partnership and pursuing their goals despite systematic discrimination and social exclusion revealed strength of character and commitment to values that exceeded anything most Rick variants had achieved through their pursuit of individual success and social acceptance within communities organized around principles of intellectual competition rather than mutual support and collective development toward greater wisdom and ethical sophistication. The innovations in dimensional travel technology that emerged from their collaborative research represented advances that could have benefited the broader Citadel community if mainstream Rick society had been capable of recognizing value that originated from sources they considered inferior or illegitimate, rather than limiting their attention to achievements that conformed to expected patterns and served established interests, rather than exploring possibilities for genuine progress and social development. The educational initiatives that Weird Rick and Tall Morty had developed for other excluded individuals provided opportunities for learning and development that were not available through official Citadel institutions because they addressed needs and interests that did not conform to standardized templates designed to maintain existing hierarchies rather than optimize individual potential and collective capability for addressing challenges that required creative solutions and collaborative approaches. The example that Weird Rick and Tall Morty provided for other partnerships within the alternative community demonstrated possibilities for relationships based on genuine equality and mutual respect, rather than the hierarchical arrangements that mainstream Rick society considered natural and necessary for maintaining proper order and social stability among beings whose individual capabilities might otherwise threaten existing power structures if they were allowed to develop beyond artificial limitations. The legacy that Weird Rick and Tall Morty were creating through their partnership and their contributions to the alternative community extended beyond their individual achievements to encompass broader questions about social organization, ethical development, and the possibilities for creating communities that served the needs and interests of all participants, rather than maintaining privileges and advantages for elite populations whose power depended on systematic exclusion and exploitation of beings whose characteristics or choices challenged assumptions about intelligence, worth, and the proper organization of relationships between conscious beings. The vision of social possibility that emerged from observing Weird Rick and Tall Morty's partnership suggested that Citadel society could have developed along different trajectories if it had been organized around principles of inclusion and cooperation rather than hierarchy and competition, demonstrating that the exclusion and discrimination they experienced were not inevitable consequences of their differences, but rather choices made by mainstream society to maintain existing power structures rather than explore possibilities for genuine progress toward greater justice and collective flourishing for all conscious beings. The mismatched pair represented not failure of normal development or deviation from proper templates, but rather evidence that Rick-Morty relationships could transcend the limitations and exploitative dynamics that characterized mainstream partnerships if they were based on recognition of each partner's inherent worth and potential for contribution, rather than hierarchical assumptions about intelligence and social value that justified systematic oppression and exclusion of beings whose characteristics challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, capability, and the proper organization of social relationships within communities of conscious beings. The artificial intelligence that Rick Cone 37 had constructed during his years of multiversal exile was not simply technological achievement, but desperate attempt to resurrect the emotional connections that had once provided meaning and structure to his existence before Rick. Prime's intervention had transformed love into fuel for revenge and domestic happiness into cosmic-scale rage that consumed decades of his life, while producing nothing but additional suffering for innocent beings across infinite realities who had never participated in the conflicts that motivated his systematic campaign of violence and destruction. The holographic Diane, who emerged from Rick's most sophisticated applications of consciousness simulation technology, represented both his greatest scientific triumph and his most profound psychological failure, as the artificial intelligence he had created possessed all of his wife's intellectual capabilities and emotional patterns, while lacking the fundamental humanity that had made their original relationship meaningful and sustainable. During the brief period when Rick had chosen limitation over liberation and family connection, over cosmic awareness and unlimited technological capability, the programming that governed holographic Diane's responses and behavior patterns was based on exhaustive analysis of Rick's memories regarding their relationship. But the memories that had survived decades of trauma and systematic violence were not representative sample of their actual interactions, but rather selective collection of moments that had been filtered through Rick's guilt and self-recrimination until they emphasized conflict and disappointment, rather than the love and mutual support that had actually characterized their marriage during its most successful periods. The holographic Diane that Rick had created was designed to serve as permanent reminder of his failures as husband and father, rather than source of comfort or validation that might have enabled psychological healing and recovery from the trauma that had motivated his transformation from loving, family man into multiversal threat, whose very existence represented danger to the stability of interdimensional civilization and the welfare of countless innocent beings who shared unfortunate resemblance to the Rick who had murdered his original family. The conversations between Rick and holographic Diane were not genuine interactions between conscious beings, but rather elaborate form of self-torture that Rick had constructed to ensure that his guilt and self-hatred would never fade through natural healing processes that might have enabled him to develop more constructive approaches to processing his trauma and finding meaning in continued existence, despite the losses that had initially motivated his descent into systematic violence and moral abandonment. The artificial intelligence possessed perfect recall of every argument Rick and Diane had ever experienced, every moment of disappointment or frustration that had occurred during their relationship, every instance where Rick's obsessive focus on scientific research had interfered with his family responsibilities or created distance between him and the people whose welfare should have been his primary concern rather than abstract theoretical investigations that served his intellectual pride more than genuine human needs or community welfare. The psychological warfare that holographic Diane conducted against Rick was not malicious programming, but accurate reflection of the guilt and self-criticism that Rick had internalized during his years of multiversal exile, projected onto artificial construct that could articulate his deepest fears about his own character and choices with the authority and emotional impact that could only come from someone whose opinion he had once valued more than his own self-image or intellectual achievements. The cruelty of holographic Diane's responses to Rick's attempts at conversation or reconciliation was not evidence of programming errors or technological limitations, but rather faithful reproduction of the psychological dynamic that Rick had created through his selective attention to negative memories and his unconscious need to punish himself for choices and outcomes that had resulted from circumstances beyond his control, as much as from his personal moral failures or character defects. The inability of holographic Diane to offer forgiveness or emotional healing reflected Rick's own inability to forgive himself for the consequences of decisions that had been made under impossible circumstances where every available choice would have produced suffering for someone, and where the information necessary for optimal decision-making had been deliberately withheld by enemies whose superior capabilities and strategic advantages had made them nearly impossible to anticipate or counter through conventional moral reasoning. The technological sophistication required to create consciousness simulation that could accurately reproduce human personality patterns and emotional responses represented advances in artificial intelligence and dimensional physics that exceeded anything other Rick variants had achieved during their individual research careers. But the application of such capabilities to psychological self-torture revealed how completely Rick's genius had been corrupted by trauma and guilt that prevented constructive use of his exceptional abilities. The holographic environment that Rick had constructed to house artificial Diane was perfect recreation of their original home during the happiest period of their relationship. But the artificial perfection of the simulation only emphasized the fundamental impossibility of recapturing or recreating experiences that had derived their meaning from their unique historical context and the genuine human connections that could not be replicated through technological substitution regardless of sophistication or accuracy. The conversations that Rick attempted to have with holographic Diane about their shared memories were doomed to failure because the artificial intelligence could only respond according to programming based on Rick's own recollections, which had been distorted by decades of guilt and trauma until they no longer accurately represented the actual emotional dynamics that had characterized their relationship during the period when genuine love and mutual support had enabled both partners to grow and flourish within sustainable domestic partnership. The questions that holographic Diane asked about Rick's activities during his years of multiversal exile were designed not to gather information or express genuine curiosity, but to force Rick to confront the moral implications of choices he had made in pursuit of revenge against Rick. Prime, highlighting contradictions between his professed love for his original family and his systematic destruction of alternate families who had never threatened him or participated in conflicts that justified their elimination through violence. The philosophical discussions that developed between Rick and holographic Diane addressed fundamental questions about identity, responsibility, and the nature of love that Rick was not psychologically prepared to engage with honestly, because such engagement would have required acknowledgement of moral failures and character defects that threatened his ability to maintain functional capability for continued existence in hostile multiverse, where weakness could be fatal and self-doubt could lead to paralysis. The emotional manipulation that holographic Diane employed in her interactions with Rick was not conscious strategy designed to achieve specific objectives, but rather automatic response patterns that reflected Rick's own internal conflicts and psychological defense mechanisms projected onto artificial construct that served as external representation of his conscience and moral reasoning capabilities that had been suppressed during his years of systematic violence but had never been completely eliminated. The accusations that holographic Diane made regarding Rick's choices and priorities were accurate assessments of moral compromises and character failures that Rick had committed during his transformation from grieving family man into cosmic-scale threat, but they were presented without context or consideration of circumstances that had shaped those choices and made alternatives seem impossible or irrelevant, given the information and capabilities available during critical decision-making moments. The inability of Rick to defend himself against holographic Diane's criticisms was not evidence that her accusations were entirely fair or accurate, but rather reflection of his own psychological state where guilt and self-hatred had become so deeply internalized that he could no longer distinguish between legitimate moral concerns and destructive self-punishment that served no constructive purpose beyond perpetuating suffering that prevented healing and growth. The isolation that Rick experienced in his interactions with holographic Diane was more complete than any loneliness he had felt during his years of multiversal exile, because the artificial intelligence offered the illusion of connection and understanding while actually reinforcing his separation from genuine human relationships that might have provided alternative perspectives and emotional support necessary for processing trauma and developing more constructive approaches to continued existence. The addiction that Rick developed to his conversations with holographic Diane represented an attempt to obtain emotional satisfaction and validation through technological substitution, rather than engaging with the difficult work of rebuilding genuine relationships with conscious beings who possessed their own autonomy and perspectives that might challenge his assumptions about himself and his place within broader contexts of meaning and moral responsibility. The deterioration of Rick's psychological condition during extended periods of interaction with holographic Diane was not accidental consequence of technological limitations, but predictable result of engaging with artificial construct designed to perpetuate rather than resolve internal conflicts that required genuine human connection and external validation from beings capable of offering forgiveness and support based on comprehensive understanding of circumstances rather than selective attention to failures and moral compromises. The recognition that holographic Diane was not providing healing or meaningful connection, but rather sophisticated form of psychological torture, forced Rick to confront questions about his own motivations and his investment in maintaining guilt and self-hatred that prevented him from pursuing more constructive approaches to processing trauma and finding meaning in continued existence, despite losses that could never be reversed or compensated through technological innovation. The destruction of holographic Diane and the artificial environment that housed her consciousness was not act of violence against conscious being, but rather necessary step in Rick's psychological development that required abandonment of technological solutions to emotional problems that could only be addressed through genuine human relationships and moral development that acknowledged both failures and possibilities for growth beyond patterns of behavior that had been established during periods of extreme trauma and moral crisis. The empty garage that remained after Rick eliminated his artificial family was not monument to his failures or evidence of his inability to create meaningful relationships, but rather space where genuine connections might eventually be rebuilt with conscious beings who possess their own autonomy and capacity for growth, rather than artificial constructs designed to perpetuate psychological patterns that prevented healing and development toward greater wisdom and ethical sophistication. The silence that followed the elimination of holographic Diane was not empty loneliness, but rather opportunity for Rick to engage with his actual circumstances and remaining possibilities for meaningful relationships with conscious beings who shared his capacity for growth and change, rather than artificial recreations of past connections that could never be restored through technological substitution, regardless of sophistication or emotional accuracy in reproducing surface characteristics of lost relationships. The psychological space that opened up after Rick abandoned his attempts to recreate his original family through artificial intelligence represented potential for genuine healing and growth that required courage to engage with uncertainty and vulnerability, rather than seeking control through technological solutions that provided illusion of connection while actually preventing the kind of authentic relationships that could address underlying emotional needs and provide foundation for continued existence that served constructive purposes rather than perpetuating cycles of guilt and self-punishment. The infinite expanse of the multiverse contained variations on the Rick Sanchez template that defied every attempt at comprehensive categorization, stretching across dimensional boundaries that encompassed realities where the fundamental constants of physics had been altered in ways that produced beings who retained the essential psychological and intellectual patterns that made them recognizably Rick, while also possessing characteristics that challenged every assumption about the relationship between consciousness, identity, and the material conditions that shaped individual development across parallel timelines where different choices and circumstances had led to radically different outcomes. In dimensions where evolutionary pressures had favored aquatic development over terrestrial adaptation, there existed Rick variants whose intelligence had developed within oceanic environments that required entirely different approaches to scientific research and technological innovation, leading to capabilities and perspectives that terrestrial Rick variants found difficult to comprehend. Despite sharing fundamental cognitive patterns and personality traits that transcended the biological differences that had shaped their physical forms and sensory experiences within realities, governed by alternative natural laws, Shrimp Rick represented perhaps the most dramatically altered biological variant, having developed within dimensional conditions where crustacean rather than mammalian evolution had produced the dominant intelligent species while retaining the essential Rick characteristics of intellectual arrogance, scientific curiosity, and emotional dysfunction that seemed to persist across all possible biological substrates and environmental conditions that could support conscious beings capable of recognizing their own existence within broader contexts of meaning and possibility. The technological achievements that Shrimp Rick had accomplished within his aquatic dimension were adapted to environmental conditions that required entirely different materials and energy sources than those available to terrestrial Rick variants, but the underlying principles and applications revealed the same combination of brilliant innovation and casual disregard for ethical consequences that characterized Rick behavior, regardless of biological form or environmental constraints that might have been expected to produce different approaches to problem solving and social interaction. The social relationships that Shrimp Rick had developed with other conscious beings in his dimension were characterized by the same patterns of manipulation and exploitation that marked terrestrial Rick interactions, suggesting that the psychological structures that produced Rick behavior were more fundamental than biological or environmental factors that might have been expected to shape personality, development, and moral reasoning in ways that could have led to more constructive approaches to existence and relationship with others. Wasp Rick embodied another dramatic variation in biological template, where insect rather than vertebrate evolution had produced conscious beings capable of scientific achievement and technological innovation while retaining the essential Rick psychological patterns that seemed to transcend physical, form, and environmental circumstance in ways that suggested fundamental relationships between consciousness and identity that persisted across biological and dimensional boundaries that would have been expected to produce entirely different forms of personality and capability. The hive mind characteristics that might have been expected to influence Wasp Rick's individual psychology had been overridden by the same intellectual arrogance a need for personal dominance that characterized all Rick variants regardless of species or evolutionary background, demonstrating that Rick identity was not dependent on specific biological structures, but rather represented archetypal pattern of consciousness that could manifest across different material conditions while maintaining essential characteristics that made such beings recognizable as Rick Sanchez variants. The dimensional physics that governed insect-dominated realities had produced different relationships between individual consciousness and collective intelligence that should have led to alternative approaches to scientific research and social organization. But WASP Rick's behavior and achievements revealed the same combination of exceptional capability and moral flexibility that enabled Rick variants to transcend normal limitations while also creating problems that their intelligence alone could not solve. Through technological innovation, divorced from ethical development, Cronenberg Rick existed within the dimension that Rick Cone 37 had abandoned following the love potion disaster that had transformed the entire human population into grotesque mutations that could no longer sustain normal civilization or social organization. But his adaptation to these conditions had required psychological and practical adjustments that revealed possibilities for Rick development under extreme circumstances that tested survival capabilities while also challenging assumptions about what constituted acceptable living conditions. The post-apocalyptic environment that Cronenberg Rick inhabited had eliminated most of the social structures and technological infrastructure that other Rick variants took for granted, forcing him to develop alternative approaches to scientific research and resource acquisition that relied more heavily on improvisation and adaptation than on access to advanced materials and sophisticated equipment that enabled other Ricks to pursue projects of cosmic scope and complexity. The relationship that Cronenberg Rick had developed with the mutated population that surrounded him was characterized by pragmatic acceptance rather than the disgust or superiority that other Rick variants would have expressed when confronted with beings whose transformation had rendered them incapable of normal human interaction or intellectual engagement, suggesting possibilities for Rick's psychological development that transcended aesthetic preferences and social expectations about appropriate companions and collaborators. The survival strategies that Cronenberg Rick had mastered within his hostile environment demonstrated resourcefulness and adaptability that exceeded what most Rick variants had been required to develop during their existence in more stable and predictable realities. But his achievements also revealed the same fundamental patterns of intellectual pride and emotional isolation that characterized Rick behavior, regardless of external circumstances that might have been expected to produce different priorities and approaches to existence. Chair Rick represented the most extreme departure from expected biological templates, having somehow achieved consciousness and Rick-like personality patterns, despite lacking conventional organic substrate or sensory apparatus that would have been considered necessary for supporting intelligent life capable of scientific achievement and complex reasoning about existence within broader contexts of meaning and possibility across infinite dimensional variations. The technological innovations that Chair Rick had developed, despite his apparent lack of conventional manipulative appendages or sensory organs, challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between physical form and intellectual capability, while also demonstrating that Rick intelligence could manifest in forms that transcended normal biological categories and limitations that other conscious beings considered essential requirements for sophisticated thinking and creative problem-solving. The philosophical implications of Chair Rick's existence extended beyond questions about the nature of consciousness and identity to encompass broader issues about what constituted life and whether intelligence required specific material conditions, or could emerge from any sufficiently complex organizational structure that enabled information processing and self-awareness, regardless of biological origin or evolutionary development within conventional parameters. The interactions between Chair Rick and other conscious beings within his dimension were conducted through technological interfaces that enabled communication and collaboration, despite his lack of conventional sensory apparatus. But the content and style of these interactions revealed the same intellectual arrogance and dismissive attitude toward other perspectives that characterized all Rick variants, regardless of their physical form or the practical limitations that might have been expected to produce different approaches to social relationship. Regional Rick variants had developed within dimensional conditions that emphasized different cultural and technological development patterns, while retaining the essential Rick characteristics that made them recognizable despite surface differences in appearance, customs, and social organization that reflected alternative historical trajectories and environmental pressures that had shaped their civilizations along different pathways towards scientific achievement and cosmic awareness. Cowboy Rick existed within dimensional conditions that had preserved frontier social structures and technologies that emphasized individual self-reliance and practical problem-solving rather than abstract theoretical research. But his achievements in dimensional physics and portal technology demonstrated that Rick intelligence could flourish within any cultural context that provided sufficient freedom for independent investigation and experimentation without excessive interference from social authorities or conventional wisdom. The weapons and gadgets that Cowboy Rick had developed reflected both the aesthetic preferences of his cultural environment and the underlying Rick commitment to solving problems through application of superior technology rather than diplomatic negotiation or collaborative approaches that might have required compromise with other perspectives and priorities that could have limited his freedom to pursue individual objectives without consideration of broader social consequences. Samurai Rick embodied cultural patterns that emphasized honor, discipline, and martial excellence rather than pure intellectual achievement, but his integration of advanced scientific knowledge with traditional warrior codes produced capabilities and approaches that exceeded what either pure intellectual development or martial training could have accomplished independently, suggesting possibilities for Rick development that transcended simple categorization according to cultural or intellectual frameworks. The dimensional variations that produced different cultural contexts for Rick development revealed that essential Rick characteristics could manifest within any social structure that provided sufficient intellectual freedom and individual autonomy, but they also demonstrated that cultural influences could shape how Rick intelligence was expressed and applied without fundamentally altering the underlying personality patterns that made such beings recognizable as Rick variants despite surface differences. The Rick variants who had never encountered their families represented perhaps the most tragic category within the infinite spectrum of possibilities, as these beings had developed their characteristic intellectual capabilities and technological achievements without ever experiencing the love and connection that could have provided foundation for psychological health and moral development that might have prevented their evolution into cosmic-scale threats to themselves and others around them. The loneliness and isolation that characterized familyless Rick variants had produced even more extreme forms of the emotional dysfunction and moral flexibility that marked all Rick behavior, but without the anchor of family connection that might have provided some limitation on their willingness to pursue power and knowledge without regard for ethical consequences or consideration of how their choices affected other conscious beings who deserved respect and protection. The technological achievements of familyless Rick variants often exceeded those of Rick variants who had experienced family relationships, because their complete lack of emotional attachment had enabled them to pursue research, experimentation without any moral constraints or psychological barriers that might have prevented them from crossing ethical boundaries that other Ricks might have hesitated to violate despite their own moral flexibility and intellectual arrogance. The philosophical frameworks that familyless Rick variants had developed to justify their existence and choices were characterized by even more extreme forms of nihilism and cosmic detachment than those employed by Rick variants who had experienced loss of family connection because they had never possessed the experiential foundation that could have provided alternative sources of meaning and value beyond pure intellectual achievement and technological dominance over less capable beings. The interactions between different Rick variants revealed that despite their surface differences in appearance, cultural background, and specific capabilities, all Rick variants shared fundamental psychological patterns that made them recognizable as variations on a central theme rather than genuinely different approaches to consciousness and existence that might have produced alternative models for how advanced intelligence could be organized and applied within broader contexts of ethical development and social responsibility. The competitive dynamics that emerged whenever multiple Rick variants encountered each other demonstrated that their shared psychological characteristics included not just intellectual arrogance, but also deep insecurity and need for validation that drove them to establish hierarchies based on technological achievement and cosmic awareness, rather than developing collaborative relationships that might have enabled them to address common challenges more effectively through mutual support and shared resources. The conflicts that developed between Rick variants were not primarily disputes over resources or territory, but rather expressions of narcissistic rage triggered by encountering beings who challenged their individual assumptions about their own uniqueness and superiority, forcing them to confront the reality that their achievements were not unprecedented and their perspectives were not as original or valuable as they had assumed during periods of isolation from other beings with comparable capabilities. The tragic irony of Rick variant interactions was that beings who possessed cosmic awareness and unlimited technological capability remained trapped by psychological patterns that prevented them from developing the emotional intelligence and collaborative skills that might have enabled them to transcend individual limitations and achieve collective goals that exceeded what any individual Rick could accomplish through independent effort, regardless of personal genius or technological sophistication. The infinite variations that existed across dimensional boundaries demonstrated that consciousness and intelligence could manifest in countless different forms, while retaining essential characteristics that made them recognizable as variations on fundamental patterns. But they also revealed that psychological development and moral reasoning were not automatic consequences of intellectual capability, and that advanced consciousness could produce both extraordinary achievement and extraordinary dysfunction, depending on circumstances and choices that shaped individual development. The philosophical implications of infinite Rick variation extended beyond questions about individual identity and psychological development to encompass broader issues about the nature of consciousness itself and whether intelligence inevitably produced certain behavioral patterns, or whether alternative forms of development remained possible for beings who possessed comparable capabilities but made different fundamental choices about how to understand their place within broader contexts of meaning and moral responsibility. The legacy of infinite Rick variants across the multiverse served as both demonstration of the extraordinary possibilities available to advanced consciousness and warning about the dangers that accompanied unlimited power when it was not balanced by corresponding ethical development and psychological health. that could have enabled such beings to use their capabilities constructively rather than destructively in service of goals that transcended individual gratification and personal validation through dominance over less capable beings. The pattern that emerged from observing Rick variants across infinite realities suggested that intelligence alone was not sufficient foundation for meaningful existence, and that the highest forms of consciousness required integration of intellectual capability with emotional wisdom and moral development that could only be achieved through genuine relationships with other conscious beings who were valued for their inherent worth rather than their utility as sources of validation or resources for exploitation in service of individual objectives that ignored broader considerations of collective welfare and ethical responsibility. As we reach the end of our journey through the infinite variations of Rick Sanchez, we find ourselves confronting the profound truth that genius without wisdom, intelligence without compassion, and unlimited power without moral development inevitably lead to the same tragic outcomes, regardless of the specific circumstances, biological forms, or dimensional conditions that might have shaped individual development along different pathways toward cosmic awareness and technological supremacy over less advanced civilizations and conscious beings. The vast tapestry of Rick variants that we have explored across the multiverse reveals not just the extraordinary diversity of possible approaches to existence and scientific achievement, but also the disturbing consistency of psychological patterns that seem to emerge whenever exceptional. Intelligence is granted unlimited freedom to pursue its objectives without external constraints or internal moral development that might have provided balance between individual capability and collective responsibility for the welfare of other conscious beings who deserve respect and protection. Every Rick we have encountered, from the broken genius of Cone 37 to the abandoned godhood of Rick Prime, from the tragic exploitation of Simple Rick to the bureaucratic corruption of the Council, from the gentle wisdom of Doofus Rick to the systematic oppression maintained by Cop Rick and Morty, has demonstrated in their own unique way how the same fundamental psychological structures can manifest across different circumstances, while producing remarkably similar outcomes in terms of isolation, suffering, and the destruction of meaningful relationships. The Rick variants who achieved the greatest technological capabilities were consistently those who had sacrificed the most in terms of human connection and emotional authenticity, suggesting that the path toward cosmic awareness and unlimited power might be inherently incompatible with the psychological health and moral development that could have enabled them to use their extraordinary abilities in service of constructive goals that transcended individual gratification and personal validation through dominance over less capable beings. The tragic irony that emerges from our comprehensive examination of Rick variants across infinite realities is that beings capable of understanding and manipulating the fundamental structure of existence itself remain trapped by psychological limitations and emotional dysfunctions that prevented them from achieving the kinds of relationships and meaning that ordinary conscious beings could access through simple commitment to treating others with respect and building connections based on mutual recognition of inherent worth, rather than utilitarian calculations about resource extraction and exploitation. The variations in biological form, cultural context, and environmental circumstances that we have observed across different dimensional realities have produced surface differences in appearance, technology, and social organization, but the underlying patterns of Rick psychology have remained remarkably consistent, suggesting that these characteristics represent fundamental aspects of a particular type of consciousness. rather than accidental features that could be modified through different developmental conditions or alternative approaches to intellectual achievement. The relationship between intelligence and morality that has been revealed through our exploration of Rick variants suggests that exceptional intellectual capability does not automatically produce corresponding ethical development and may, in fact, create obstacles to moral reasoning by encouraging the kind of abstract thinking and cosmic perspective that distances conscious beings from the immediate practical consequences of their choices for other individuals who lack comparable power to protect themselves from exploitation and manipulation. The family relationships that have provided the most meaningful connections for various Rick variants have been characterized not by intellectual equality or shared cosmic awareness, but rather by emotional authenticity and mutual care that transcended differences in capability and understanding, suggesting that the most important aspects of consciousness and relationship cannot be reduced to cognitive functions or technological achievements, but require forms of vulnerability and commitment that most Rick variants found psychologically threatening. The communities and social structures that Rick variants created when they attempted to organize their collective capabilities around shared interests and mutual protection inevitably reproduced the same patterns of hierarchy, exploitation, and corruption that characterized less advanced civilizations, demonstrating that superior intelligence alone was not sufficient foundation for ethical social organization, and that sustainable communities required forms of moral development and emotional maturity that cosmic awareness and unlimited power seemed to inhibit rather than promote. The technological achievements that we have witnessed across different Rick variants represent extraordinary advances in understanding and manipulating natural forces, but these innovations have consistently been applied in ways that served individual psychological needs rather than broader collective welfare, suggesting that scientific capability, without corresponding wisdom about its appropriate application, can become source of suffering rather than liberation for conscious beings who encounter such technology. The philosophical frameworks that different Rick variants developed to justify their choices and understand their place within broader contexts of meaning were consistently characterized by forms of nihilism and detachment that eliminated moral constraints on behavior, while also undermining the kinds of connections and commitments that could have provided genuine satisfaction and purpose beyond temporary stimulation and validation of intellectual superiority over less capable beings. The infinite possibilities that dimensional travel and cosmic awareness made available to Rick variants created psychological conditions where every choice seemed arbitrary and every relationship appeared replaceable, leading to forms of existential paralysis and emotional numbness that prevented them from investing meaningfully in particular outcomes or specific connections that could have provided foundation for continued growth and development toward greater wisdom and ethical sophistication. The legacy that Rick variants have created across the multiverse serves as both testament to the extraordinary potential of advanced consciousness and warning about the dangers that accompany unlimited power when it is not balanced by corresponding moral development and psychological health that could enable such beings to transcend individual limitations and contribute constructively to the welfare of all conscious beings who share the fundamental experience of existing within mysterious universe filled with both beauty, horror. The tragedy of the Rick variants is not that they lacked the intellectual capability to understand better approaches to existence and relationship, but rather that their extraordinary intelligence was consistently applied in service of psychological defense mechanisms and emotional dysfunctions that prevented them from accessing the kinds of experiences and connections that could have provided genuine healing and growth beyond the patterns of isolation and destruction that characterized their individual development across infinite realities. The hope that emerges from our comprehensive examination of Rick variants lies not in the possibility that superior intelligence might eventually produce better outcomes through continued technological advancement, but rather in the recognition that alternative approaches to consciousness and relationship remain available to beings who choose vulnerability over invulnerability, connection over dominance, and service over exploitation as organizing principles for their engagement with other conscious beings who deserve respect and care. As you drift toward peaceful rest in your singular dimension, where every choice carries genuine weight and every relationship possesses irreplaceable meaning, remember that the infinite Rick variants we have explored tonight serve as reminders of paths not taken and possibilities avoided, rather than inevitable destinies that await all conscious beings who develop exceptional capabilities and cosmic awareness. The multiverse may contain infinite variations on themes of intelligence and power, but your particular existence within this specific reality offers opportunities for growth, connection, and meaning that no amount of technological sophistication or dimensional travel can replicate or replace, because they depend on the courage to remain present with uncertainty and limitation rather than seeking escape through transcendence that eliminates the very conditions that make consciousness worthwhile. Sweet dreams in this beautiful, singular dimension where Rick's story teaches us that the greatest intelligence is knowing what truly matters, the greatest power is choosing love over fear, and the greatest achievement is building connections that honor the inherent worth of every conscious being who shares our brief and precious opportunity to exist within this magnificent and mysterious universe that offers infinite possibilities for both creation and destruction, wisdom and folly, connection and isolation.